What if the email that was supposed to end your career accidentally landed in the inbox of the one man powerful enough to change everything? Sophie Bennett had nothing left. No job, no savings. A sick mother who needed medicine she couldn't afford. And one email, raw, furious, and brutally honest, that she poured her last ounce of dignity into before hitting send. She never meant for him to read it. Nathan Sterling, billionaire, widower, one of the most powerful men in American business, opened that email on a Tuesday morning and couldn't put it down. What happened next will shock you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Sophie Bennett didn't move. She lay flat on her back in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of her bedroom, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Florida, and listened to the sound of her mother coughing in the next room. 3 coughs. A pause. 4 more. She counted them the way she used to count seconds during thunderstorms as a child, as if counting gave you some kind of control over things that had no intention of being controlled. The coughing stopped. Sophie closed her eyes for exactly 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, then sat up and put her feet on the cold floor. The apartment was small in the way that only apartments in cities can be small. Not cozy small, not charming small, but the kind of small that reminds you every single morning that you are losing a financial battle you didn't choose to enter. The kitchen was separated from the living room by a counter that also served as a dining table. The bathroom door didn't close all the way unless you lifted the handle at precisely the right angle. Sophie had lived here for 4 years, and she still sometimes forgot, standing there in the dark at 6 in the morning, pulling on a handle that wouldn't give. She made coffee she couldn't really afford and stood at the window. Outside, Chicago was already awake in the way that large cities are always half awake. Delivery trucks idling, a bus sighing its way through an intersection, 2 pigeons arguing on a fire escape across the alley. The sky was the color of old dishwater, the kind of October sky that promises nothing and delivers exactly that. Sophie drank her coffee standing up. She had stopped sitting down for breakfast sometime around August, though she couldn't say exactly when or why. Somewhere between her mother's second hospital visit and the 3rd time her paycheck came in $112 short, she had simply stopped. Her mother appeared in the doorway of the kitchen at 6:15, wrapped in the blue cardigan she wore every morning, her white hair loose around her shoulders. Eleanor Bennett was 68 years old and had the kind of face that had once been beautiful in a very specific, very Midwestern way. Strong cheekbones, direct eyes, a mouth built more for honesty than for smiling. The beauty was still there if you knew where to look, but it was buried now under 4 years of illness and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had worked hard her entire life and arrived at the end of it with very little to show for the effort. "You didn't sleep," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "I slept fine." "You have that look?" "What look?" Eleanor made a vague gesture toward Sophie's face. "The look where you're already somewhere else, and your body just hasn't caught up yet." Sophie refilled her coffee cup, even though it was still half full. "I have a meeting at 9. Henderson's doing another review of the regional accounts." Her mother was quiet for a moment. She moved slowly to the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water, her movements careful and deliberate the way they'd been since the second bout of pneumonia 18 months ago had left her lungs sounding, according to her pulmonologist, like crumpled paper. "Sophie." "Mom." "You don't have to keep..." "Don't." Sophie said it quietly, but with enough weight that her mother stopped. "Please don't. Not this morning." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment with the particular sadness of a parent who knows exactly what their child is carrying and is powerless to take it from them. Then she nodded once and turned to look out the window. "It's going to rain today," she said. "Probably." "Take the umbrella by the door, the blue one. The green one has a broken spoke." Sophie almost smiled. "I know, Mom. I'm the one who broke it." The offices of Hartwell Regional Logistics occupied the top 3 floors of a building in the West Loop that had been renovated sometime in the early 2000s and then largely forgotten. The lobby had the kind of corporate aggressiveness that comes from a company that wants to look important without actually investing in looking good. Polished floors that showed every scuff mark, motivational slogans mounted on the wall in block letters that had begun to peel at the edges, a receptionist who smiled at everyone with the exact same wattage regardless of circumstance. Sophie had worked here for 6 years. 6 years was long enough to know which elevator was slower, which conference room had a broken projector bulb that no one had replaced in 11 months, and which of the 3 Henderson brothers, the company was family-owned, which made everything worse, was most likely to be drunk before noon on a Friday. The answer was Marcus, and it wasn't close. She had started as an accounts coordinator, which was a title that meant she processed invoices, reconciled shipping records, and did the kind of quiet, invisible work that keeps a company functioning without anyone noticing you're doing it. She was good at it, careful, detail-oriented, the kind of employee who noticed when numbers didn't quite add up and said so, politely, in writing, with documentation. That last quality had turned out to be a problem. Sophie took the stairs to the 4th floor because the elevator that went directly to 4 had been under maintenance for 6 weeks, which everyone understood to mean that maintenance had been requested and then quietly ignored. She pushed through the stairwell door and walked down the hallway past the row of glass-walled offices where the regional managers sat, most of them already on their phones or hunched over laptops with the focused intensity of people performing busyness rather than actually experiencing it. At the end of the hall, outside the corner office that belonged to Director of Operations Gary Henderson, the middle brother, the functional one, which was a low bar, 2 men stood talking in low voices. Sophie recognized both of them. One was Dennis Reese, Hartwell's head of HR, a thin man in his 50s with the permanently aggrieved expression of someone who had once wanted to be a lawyer and had ended up in corporate HR instead, and had never fully recovered. The other was a man she didn't recognize, younger, in his 30s, wearing a suit that was better than anything else in this building. She didn't slow down. She had learned, over 6 years, that the worst thing you could do at Hartwell was look like you were paying attention. She sat down at her desk and opened her email. There were 43 new messages. 11 of them were about the quarterly shipping report that was due Friday. 9 were from Gary Henderson's assistant forwarding reminders about the 9 a.m. meeting. 4 were from a vendor whose invoices had been on hold since September because Marcus Henderson had lost the authorization forms and refused to ask his assistant to reprint them. The other 19 were about payroll. Sophie stared at the screen. The discrepancies had started in March. Small, at first. An overtime calculation that seemed slightly off. A bonus payment that appeared in the system but didn't appear in anyone's actual paycheck. A reimbursement that vanished between submission and approval. She had flagged the first one in April, politely, to Dennis Reese in HR. Dennis had told her it was a system error that had already been corrected. She had asked for documentation of the correction. He had never provided it. By June, the numbers were telling a different story. Not system errors, not clerical mistakes, a pattern. Hourly workers in the loading and dispatch departments, the people least likely to scrutinize a pay stub, the people most likely to quietly accept what they were given, were being systematically underpaid. Overtime hours were being recorded internally, but not reflected in paychecks. Deductions were appearing under categories that didn't correspond to any benefit the employees had signed up for. Sophie had the spreadsheets, she had the screenshots, she had the emails she had sent to Dennis Reese and Gary Henderson, and once, in a moment of desperation, directly to the oldest Henderson brother, Richard, who ran the company officially, but in practice spent most of his time in Palm Beach. None of them had responded to the substance of what she was saying. Dennis had called her into his office twice to discuss her communication style. Gary had sent her an email so vague it could have been written by someone who had never read her original message. Richard had not responded at all. In August, she had been moved to a different team, which was presented to her as a lateral promotion and which she understood immediately as a warning. In September, her own pay had been cut by 8%, attributed to a department restructuring that applied, as far as she could tell, only to her. In early October, a loading dock supervisor named Carl Whitmore, who had been the only manager willing to confirm what she was seeing in the payroll data, had been fired. The stated reason was performance deficiencies. Carl had worked for Hartwell for 11 years. He had never once received a negative performance review. Sophie had $63 in her checking account. Her mother's prescription cost $87 a month without insurance coverage, and Eleanor's supplemental insurance had been discontinued in July due to a paperwork error that Sophie had spent 3 weeks trying to correct and eventually given up on. She opened a new email draft. She wrote it in 45 minutes, which was both too long and not long enough. She had been composing versions of it in her head for months. In the shower, on the bus, at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and her mother's breathing from the next room was the only sound in the apartment. She had written it angry. She had written it measured. She had written it in the careful, documented language of someone building a legal case. And she had written it in the raw, stripped-down language of someone who simply needed to be heard. What she wrote that morning was none of those versions and all of them at once. She didn't use corporate language. She didn't attach spreadsheets. She wrote what it was actually like. The specific daily reality of working in a place where the people at the top had decided that the people at the bottom were a resource to be managed rather than human beings whose time and labor had value. She wrote about Carl Whitmore, who had a daughter starting college next year, and who had just lost 11 years of employment because he had told the truth. She wrote about the dispatch workers who stayed late on Fridays to make sure the trucks were prepped and documented those hours, and then saw those hours simply vanish from their pay stubs without explanation or recourse. She wrote about what it was like to send the same email 17 times and receive in return nothing but increasingly sophisticated deflections. She wrote, "I used to believe that if you did the work carefully and told the truth clearly and gave people enough documentation, someone would eventually do the right thing. I have now sent 17 separate documented complaints about wage manipulation in this company over a period of 6 months. I have been moved to a different department, had my own pay cut, and watched the one manager who confirmed my findings be terminated. I no longer believe that doing the work carefully and telling the truth clearly is enough. I'm not sure I know what is enough, but I know I can't stay here." She wrote, "The workers whose wages have been stolen are not statistics. They are people who are behind on rent and skipping doctor's appointments and telling their kids they can't afford new shoes because a company that is profitable enough to fly its ownership to Palm Beach decided that labor protection laws are a cost to be minimized rather than a floor to stand on." She wrote, "I'm leaving today. I'm sending this to you as my official notice and as the only form of accountability I have left. I'm not asking for anything. I just need someone to know what happened here." She addressed it to Gary Henderson. At least, she thought she did. Her hands were shaking slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would notice, but enough that when she clicked through the autocomplete options that appeared when she typed GAR, she selected the second option instead of the first without realizing it. Gary Henderson's email address began with @. The address she selected began with GH and then resolved into something else entirely. She hit send before she looked at the address field. Then she gathered her things, walked to the elevator, the slow one, rode it down to the lobby, and left Hartwell Regional Logistics for the last time. She did not take an umbrella. It had already started to rain. Nathan Sterling's morning had started at 4:45, which was when his daughter decided she needed to tell him something important. "Dad." He was not fully awake. He was, in fact, somewhere in the specific half-sleep that is worse than being fully awake, because you are too conscious to rest, but too unconscious to think, lying on his back with one arm over his eyes, against the light that Maya had switched on without apparent concern for whether he was ready for it. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "What time is it?" "It doesn't matter. It's about the science project." Nathan moved his arm enough to look at his daughter. Maya Sterling was 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that she refused to let anyone brush properly, and a serious expression that she wore more often than seemed statistically likely for a 7-year-old. She was standing at the foot of his bed in her pajamas, the ones with the small yellow stars, holding a piece of poster board and looking at him with the specific urgency of a child who has decided that something is a crisis. "What about the science project?" "I did it wrong." "What do you mean you did it wrong?" "I did the one about weather patterns, but Ms. Fraser said we were supposed to pick something we could test. You can't test weather patterns if you don't have equipment." Nathan sat up. "Maya, the project isn't due until Thursday." "It's Tuesday. That gives us 2 days." "That gives us 2 days," Maya repeated, in a tone that suggested this was not sufficient. Then she turned and walked out of his room, apparently satisfied that she had delivered her information and that it was now his problem. Nathan Sterling, who by most metrics available to the public was a successful man, founder and CEO of Sterling Workplace Solutions, net worth somewhere in the range that financial magazines cited, with the specific breathlessness they reserved for numbers ordinary people couldn't visualize, named 3 times in the last 5 years to various lists of influential people in American business, lay back in his bed and stared at the ceiling of his Chicago penthouse apartment and thought about weather patterns. His day started properly at 6. He had a standing call with his COO, Rachel Okafor, at 6:30, which she conducted from her home office in Boston, with the efficiency of someone who had worked with him long enough to anticipate his objections before he voiced them. He was in his own office, the building he owned, not the penthouse, the actual offices of Sterling Workplace Solutions 6 blocks away, by 7:30. The office was the kind of place that looked to outside observers like evidence of success, which it was, but which functioned, on the inside, more like a machine than like a workplace. 63 employees across 2 floors, a legal team, a policy team, a communications team, a research department, a boardroom on the top floor that Nathan rarely used because he preferred the conference rooms on 3, which had windows that faced north and in winter caught the early light in a way that made the lake look like hammered silver. He had built Sterling Workplace Solutions in 5 years, starting with the conviction, naive, his investors had initially told him, and then eventually correct, which was more satisfying, that companies which treated their employees well were also, in the long run, more profitable. The company developed workplace policy frameworks, consulted with corporations on labor practice improvements, and increasingly had moved into policy advocacy at the state and federal level. They had influenced 9 separate pieces of state labor legislation in the last 3 years. They were currently in the middle of a campaign around what they called the Transparency Standard, a policy framework that would require companies above a certain size to submit to independent payroll audits and establish formal channels for wage-related complaints. Nathan believed in the Transparency Standard. He had spent 11 months developing it. He was also, quietly, beginning to worry that the version his board was going to vote on in 10 days was not the version that would actually accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish. He was thinking about this, sitting at his desk with the draft policy document open on his screen and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, when the email arrived. The name in the sender field was Sophie Bennett. He didn't recognize it. The address field resolved to his, which sometimes happened when people were contacting him for the first time. His address was semi-public, listed in the company's general contact information, which he'd regretted more than once. He almost closed it. He didn't close it. He wasn't sure later why he didn't. His inbox on a Tuesday morning at 7:43 contained 47 other unread messages. He had a strategy meeting at 9, a call with the senator's legislative director at 11, a lunch with a foundation board he sat on at 1. He did not, technically, have time to read an unsolicited email from someone named Sophie Bennett. He read it anyway. And then he read it again. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He had built a company on the specific premise that workplace dysfunction was predictable, documentable, and correctable. He had read hundreds of complaints, testimonials, and case studies. He had sat across from workers, managers, executives, and lawyers. He had heard stories of wage theft, intimidation, and retaliation in granular documented detail. He had never read anything quite like this. It wasn't the documentation. There were no spreadsheets attached, no exhibits, no legal language. It was the opposite of that. It was just a woman telling the truth in her own words, without armor or performance, about what it was actually like to be inside a system that had decided she didn't matter. I used to believe that if you did the work carefully and told the truth clearly. He reached the end and sat still for a moment. Rachel appeared in his doorway. She did this, appeared, rather than knocked, because his office had a glass door that he kept open most of the time, and she had long ago decided that the open door was implicit permission for entry. "You have prep for the strategy meeting in..." She stopped. "What are you reading?" "An email." "From who?" "Sophie Bennett." Rachel's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved slightly in the way they did when she was processing new information. "I don't know that name." "Neither do I." Is it relevant to the transparency standard? Nathan looked at the screen for another moment. It might be the most relevant thing I've read in the last 11 months. Rachel came around the desk and read over his shoulder. He watched her expression as she read, the slight tightening around her eyes in the middle, the pause near the end where she stopped and reread something. "She sent this to you by mistake," Rachel said. "I know. She meant to send it to her supervisor." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Nathan leaned back in his chair. Outside the windows, the lake was dark under the October clouds, a flat iron color that made it look more like a road than like water. "I don't know yet," he said, which was almost certainly a lie. Sophie spent the morning of her resignation sitting in a coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue that she couldn't afford to sit in, drinking a $12 latte she'd bought because the alternative was going home, and she wasn't ready to explain to her mother what she'd done. She had her laptop open. She was pretending to look at job listings on 3 different websites, but mostly she was staring at the coffee cup and listening to the ambient sound of other people's mornings. A woman at the next table on a work call, 2 college students arguing cheerfully about something she couldn't quite make out, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional bright sound of the door opening to let in a gust of cold October air. She had left a job. She had left a job with $63 in her checking account, and a mother who needed $87 of medication every 30 days, and an apartment she was 11 days away from the first of the month on. She opened a new browser tab and closed it without looking at it. She was not by nature a person who made dramatic decisions. She was a person who made careful ones. She had taken 4 years to finish her accounting degree, going at night while working days, because it was the only pace she could manage. She had taken 3 separate certification exams, failing the second one the first time and retaking it 3 months later. She had stayed at Hartwell 6 years. 2 years past when she should have left, she now understood, because she had been trying to build something stable, and she had believed for a long time that stability required endurance. She did not feel like someone who had just made a courageous decision. She felt like someone who had jumped off a ledge and was currently in the specific window of time between leaving the ledge and understanding how far it was to the ground. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Is this Sophie Bennett?" The voice was male, quiet, careful, not aggressive, not the kind of salesperson voice that accelerated into its pitch, more like someone choosing each word in real time. "Who is this?" "My name is Nathan Sterling. I think you sent me an email this morning that was meant for someone else." Sophie went very still. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "you know who I am." "I know who you are." She'd seen the name in a business magazine her mother kept in the waiting room of her specialist's office. Sterling Workplace Solutions. The article had called him the conscience of corporate America, which was the kind of thing business magazines said about people who were successful enough that it had become safe to credit them with principles. "I read your letter," Nathan said. "It wasn't meant for you." "I know. I'm sorry for that. But I read it, and I'd like—" He stopped. Started again. "I have some questions, if you're willing." "What kind of questions?" "About what you described. The payroll patterns, the complaint process. Specifically, I'd like to understand—" Another pause, and she had the strange impression that he was editing something out. "You wrote that you sent 17 documented complaints over 6 months. I'd like to understand what responses you received." Sophie looked at her coffee cup. "Why?" "Because I'm working on something, and I think you might understand it better than most people I've talked to." "Mr. Sterling, I just quit my job this morning. I'm not really in a position to—" "I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm just asking you to talk to me." She should have said no. She knew, even in the moment, that she should have said no. She was in no position to be talked into anything by anyone, and she had spent 6 years learning that powerful people who framed their requests as casual conversations were, in her experience, managing her rather than talking to her. But there was something in his voice, not warmth exactly, more like a specific kind of tiredness that she recognized, that made her hesitate. "What are you working on?" she asked. "A policy framework around wage transparency." Independent payroll audits. Formal complaint channels. What kind of complaint channels? That's one of the things I'd like to talk about. She looked at the door of the coffee shop. Outside, it was raining harder now. A woman was wrestling with an umbrella that had turned inside out. I have time, Sophie said, because she did not, in fact, have anywhere to be. They talked for an hour. Not in person. She was still in the coffee shop, and he, she gathered, was in his office. But long enough that Sophie's coffee went completely cold, and she bought a glass of water to justify continuing to occupy the table. He was not what she expected. She had expected the managed warmth of a CEO, the practiced listener's performance, the strategically deployed self-deprecation. She had encountered enough executives at Hartwell to know what that sounded like. The rhythm of someone who had learned that appearing to listen was a form of control. Nathan Sterling listened differently. He asked short questions. He didn't rush to fill silence. When she said something he disagreed with, he said so directly, without the softening language that usually preceded a corporate disagreement. She told him about the complaint process, not the emotional version she'd written in the letter, but the documented version. The sequence of emails, the responses she'd received, the patterns she'd noticed in how the complaints had been handled. They never rejected the substance, she said. That's the thing I keep thinking about. Every time I sent documentation of a specific discrepancy, the response was always about something else. My tone, the timing, whether I'd followed the correct process. Nobody ever actually said, these numbers are wrong, and here's why. Because they couldn't, Nathan said. Right. So the complaint process was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was create the appearance of accountability without any of the substance. That's the gap our current framework doesn't address, Nathan said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. The draft we have, it requires companies to have a complaint process, but it doesn't specify what a valid response to a complaint looks like. A valid response should require addressing the actual substance of the complaint. Our legal team is concerned about the liability implications. Your legal team is concerned about protecting companies, Sophie said, and then stopped because she didn't know this man and she had just told him his legal team had the wrong priorities. But Nathan didn't sound offended. He sounded like someone who had heard something he already knew but needed to hear, said plainly. Yes, he said. That's essentially correct. There was a pause. Outside, the rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle. Mr. Sterling, Sophie said. Nathan. She ignored that. The version you described, the one where companies can report wage manipulation rather than face immediate mandatory correction, that's not reform. That's documentation of the problem with no mechanism for fixing it. The board believes it's the version that can actually pass. The board is not wrong that it can pass. They're wrong that passing it accomplishes anything. Another silence. Longer this time. I'd like to send you the current draft, Nathan said, if you're willing to read it and tell me what's wrong with it. Sophie looked at her phone. She thought about the $63. She thought about her mother's medication. She thought about Carl Whitmore, who had been fired 11 years in for telling the truth about the same thing she had just told this man. I'll read it, she said. Thank you. I'm not doing you a favor, she said. I'm doing it because if your policy passes and it doesn't actually work, that's worse than not having it at all. It lets companies say they're in compliance while the same thing keeps happening. I understand that. I'm not sure you do yet. There was a beat. And then, unexpectedly, Nathan Sterling laughed. Not the polished social laugh she'd been bracing for, but something shorter and more genuine, the laugh of a man who has just been told something that landed correctly. You might be right, he said. Sophie looked at her empty coffee cup. Send me the draft, she said. The document arrived in her email at 2:17 that afternoon. Sophie was home by then. Her mother was asleep in the bedroom. She napped in the early afternoon, a habit the pneumonia had installed, and that her body had kept even after her lungs had somewhat recovered. The apartment was quiet except for the rain against the windows and the particular tick and settle sounds that old buildings make in cold weather. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and read the policy framework. It was objectively better than most things she had encountered in her professional life. It was well written, clearly structured, built on genuine research. The principles section was almost exactly right. The compliance requirements were detailed. The enforcement mechanism was the problem. The enforcement mechanism was the problem in the specific way that enforcement mechanisms were always the problem in documents written by people who understood systems better than they understood the people inside systems. It assumed that companies would report their own violations, given the right incentives. It assumed that employees who experienced wage manipulation would use the formal complaint channels rather than staying silent for the same reasons they had always stayed silent. Because the formal complaint channels were controlled by the same organizations that were committing the manipulation. She opened a reply email and started writing. She didn't intend it to be long. It was long anyway. The core principle of Section 4.2 assumes that disclosure creates accountability. In theory, this is correct. In practice, this only works if the entity making the disclosure has an independent reason to be accurate. A company that discovers wage manipulation through an internal audit and is required to report it to a regulatory body will, in the absence of independent verification, report what serves its interest to report. This is not cynicism. This is what the documented evidence of complaint outcomes in my own 6 years of experience consistently shows. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about the specific mechanisms that allowed disclosure requirements to become compliance theater. She wrote about what independent verification actually needed to look like. She wrote about the difference between a complaint channel that existed and a complaint channel that worked. She sent it at 4:45. His response arrived at 6:12, which meant he had read it in the window between whatever his last afternoon meeting was and what she assumed was dinner, or perhaps his daughter's bedtime. She had registered, without making much of it, that he'd mentioned picking his daughter up from school at some point during their phone call. The response was 3 sentences long. This is exactly what I was afraid the draft was missing. I need to think about this. Can we talk tomorrow? Sophie stared at the email. She had spent 6 months sending documented evidence of a problem to people who had never once asked her to talk about it again. She wrote back, yes. They talked the next day and the day after that. The conversations followed a pattern that Sophie didn't entirely trust. Nathan would send her a section of the policy. She would respond with what was wrong with it. He would push back. She would hold her position if she was right and concede if she wasn't. And at the end, they would have moved incrementally closer to something that might actually work. She still didn't trust him. That felt important to maintain. On the 3rd day, she told him this directly because she was tired and her mother had had a bad night and she didn't have the energy to manage what she said carefully. I want to be honest with you about something, she said. They were on the phone again. She had, she noticed, begun to pace when she talked to him, a habit she didn't have in other phone conversations. I don't fully trust this process. Okay, Nathan said. I've watched powerful people engage with this exact problem for 6 years. The pattern is always the same. They acknowledge that it's real. They say they want to fix it, and then the version they actually implement protects their interests rather than the workers' interests. And they're usually sincere about it. That's the part that makes it worse. They're not lying when they say they want to fix it. They just don't want to fix it at any cost to themselves, Nathan said. Yes. That's a fair description of most institutional reform processes. Is it a fair description of you? The silence that followed was long enough that she began to regret asking. Then Nathan said, I don't know. I'd like to believe I'm different, but I'd like to believe a lot of things about myself that I can't fully verify. Sophie stopped pacing. That's the most honest thing a person in your position has ever said to me, she said. I'm not sure that's a high bar. It's not, she agreed, but it's where we are. Outside the kitchen window, the light was doing the thing that October light does in the late afternoon in Chicago, coming in low and sideways through the buildings, turning everything briefly golden before the early dark fell. Sophie watched it on the wall of the apartment building across the alley, a slow rectangle of warmth moving upward as the sun dropped. She didn't tell Nathan about the light. That felt like the wrong kind of personal, but she stood at the window and looked at it while they talked about independent auditing requirements and the specific language that would make the complaint channels enforceable rather than decorative, and she noticed for the first time in a long time that she was not counting anything. 3 things Sophie didn't tell Nathan Sterling in the first week. That her mother had a pulmonologist appointment on Thursday that Sophie had quietly scheduled around their phone calls because she hadn't wanted to cancel a conversation that she was beginning to think might matter. That she had, twice, almost applied for the administrative coordinator position at a mid-sized accounting firm in the Loop, and had stopped both times with the cursor hovering over the submit button for reasons she hadn't fully identified. And that on the fourth evening after he had sent her the revised Section 4.2, and she had read it and found herself thinking that it was actually genuinely good, better than she would have believed possible 10 days ago when she sat in a rain-soaked coffee shop with $63 and no plan. She had sat at the kitchen table for a long time after closing her laptop, doing nothing, thinking about a man she had never met in person who had picked up the phone because of a letter she'd sent to the wrong address, and who had, without ever meaning to, made her feel like the 6 years hadn't been for nothing. She didn't tell him any of that. She was still Sophie Bennett. She was still a woman who had learned, specifically and repeatedly, that trusting powerful people was a particular kind of danger. But she kept talking to him, and he kept calling, and the policy kept getting better. Outside, October moved toward November, and the light got thinner, and the lake went darker, and somewhere in a glass office 6 blocks from the coffee shop where it had started, a man sat reading the notes of a woman he had never met and trying to build something that would be worth the cost. He was starting to understand he was going to have to pay. The revised Section 4.2 sat in Nathan's inbox for 11 hours before he opened it. He knew it was there. He had been checking his phone with the specific frequency of someone pretending not to check their phone, which is its own admission. Rachel had noticed. She noticed most things, and had said nothing, which was worse than if she had said something, because Rachel's silence on a subject was her way of cataloging it for later. The document was 61 pages in its revised form. Sophie had annotated the enforcement section with margin notes that were technically comments in a shared document, but which read more like a running argument with a person who wasn't in the room. Some of them were blunt to the point of being uncomfortable. One note, next to a clause about voluntary compliance incentives, read simply, "This assumes good faith." See, every company that has voluntarily self-reported wage violations in the last decade, there aren't many. That's the point. Nathan read every annotation twice. He had been building Sterling Workplace Solutions for 5 years on the conviction that corporate reform was possible from the inside, that if you built the right frameworks, created the right incentives, and worked within the existing structures of institutional power, you could move things. He believed this. He had evidence for it. 9 pieces of state legislation. 43 corporate clients who had implemented his frameworks and shown measurable improvements in employee retention, wage compliance, and workplace safety. He also knew, sitting at his desk at 7 in the morning with Sophie Bennett's annotations on his screen, that there was a version of what he was building that was comfortable and a version that was correct, and that those 2 versions were not currently the same document. He picked up his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she had been awake for a while, which was something he was beginning to understand about her, that she was a person who carried her worries into the early hours and sat with them alone before the day started. "You read it," he said. "I read it 3 days ago. You're the one who's been slow." "I've been thinking." "About which parts?" "The enforcement mechanism. The voluntary compliance section." He paused. "You're right that it assumes good faith." "I know I'm right." It wasn't arrogance when she said it. That was the thing he kept noticing. She stated what she knew with a directness that had nothing to do with ego. She wasn't performing confidence. She just didn't see any point in softening a position she'd arrived at through evidence. "If I take the voluntary compliance incentives out," Nathan said, "the board won't pass it. If you keep them in, the board passes something that doesn't work. There's a middle version." "Nathan." She said his name for the first time that morning, and he noticed it the way you notice a small shift in the weather. There is no middle version on this particular point. Either companies are required to correct documented wage violations within a defined period, subject to independent verification, or they're not. The middle version is the thing that lets them say they're compliant while continuing to do exactly what they were doing. "I know that." "Then why are we discussing the middle version?" He looked at his window. The lake was flat and gray in the early light. The kind of November gray that isn't dramatic, just persistent, like it has nowhere to be and no intention of leaving. "Because I have a board meeting in 9 days, he said. "And the board members I need to vote yes have investors behind them who profit from the current system. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person who is choosing not to say the obvious thing. "Go ahead," Nathan said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say that the people I need to convince are the same people who benefit from the problem I'm trying to fix." "I was going to say that you already know what the right version of this policy looks like," Sophie said. "You've known for a while. The question isn't what it looks like. The question is whether you're willing to put it forward knowing it might not pass." Nathan was quiet. "That's a different conversation," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "it is." She didn't push. That was another thing he'd noticed. She made her point, and then she let it sit, didn't circle back to it, didn't press. It was the opposite of how most people in his professional life operated, where every important point was made 3 times in 3 different framings to ensure it landed. Sophie said things once and trusted that you'd heard them. After they hung up, he sat for a long time without opening anything on his computer. His assistant knocked at 8:15 to remind him about the 9 o'clock team meeting. He said he'd be there. He stayed where he was for another 10 minutes, looking at the lake and thinking about a woman he'd never met who had, in the space of 2 weeks, dismantled more of his comfortable assumptions than 5 years of corporate consulting had touched. He thought, she's not wrong. He thought, she's also not the one who built this company, and she's not the one who has to sit in that boardroom. Then he closed his laptop, straightened his jacket, and went to his 9 o'clock meeting. He said the things his team needed to hear. He answered the questions that needed answering. He performed, competently and professionally, the role of a man who had everything under control. But he left the draft policy on his desk with Sophie's annotations visible on the screen, and he didn't close the document for the rest of the day. The second week of November arrived with the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It's just suddenly there, and you realize you've been cold for 3 days without quite registering it. Sophie had started wearing her winter coat on the bus, the heavy one she'd bought 3 years ago at a consignment store. Navy blue with a broken zipper on the left pocket that she'd never gotten fixed because she kept forgetting to bring it to the tailor, and then winter would end and it would seem less urgent. She was on the bus to her mother's pulmonologist appointment when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she now recognized without the contact entry she hadn't yet made. "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked at the text for a moment. Outside the bus window, the city moved past in the flat November light. Storefronts, a school, a parking lot, a taqueria with the word "open" in red letters in the window. "Depends on the question," she typed back. The reply came quickly. "How are you doing, financially?" I realize that's an intrusive question. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because it was such a specific kind of awkward. The particular awkwardness of a very wealthy person trying to ask a question about money without sounding like a very wealthy person asking a question about money. "I'm okay," she typed, which was approximately 40% true. "I want to offer you a consulting fee for the work you've been doing on the policy." She stared at the screen. "I'm not doing it as a job," she wrote back. "I know. That's why I want to pay you for it. You're doing work that has value, and you're doing it while dealing with a situation that, based on things you've mentioned, is not easy." Sophie looked up from her phone. The bus was stopping at an intersection. A man in a yellow jacket was crossing against the light, moving slowly, not looking at the traffic that had paused for him. She thought about the $63 that had become, after 2 weeks of careful rationing and one small freelance accounting job she'd found through a former colleague, approximately $217. She thought about her mother's prescription. She thought about Carl Whitmore, who had told the truth and lost 11 years. She typed, "If I take money from you, the nature of this changes." His response took longer this time. She was off the bus and walking toward the medical building when it came through. "I understand that concern. And I can't promise you it doesn't change anything. But I can tell you that what you've contributed to this policy in 2 weeks is worth more than what I've paid consultants in the last 3 months. And those consultants had no problem taking checks from me." She pushed through the door of the building. The lobby was warm and smelled like the particular combination of antiseptic and carpet cleaner that medical buildings always smell like, a scent she had come to associate not with illness but with waiting. All the specific anxiety of sitting in a plastic chair while someone you love is in a room you can't be in. She found a chair in the waiting area and sat down. Let me think about it, she wrote. Of course, he wrote back. And then, a beat later, how's your mother? She sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the question for longer than it deserved. She typed, she's managing. Today is just a routine follow-up. I hope it goes well. Sophie put her phone in her coat pocket. Around her, other people sat with their own worries in their laps. A man in his 60s with a crossword puzzle he wasn't working on, a young woman bouncing a toddler on her knee, an elderly couple sitting close enough to be touching without quite touching, the kind of proximity that comes from decades of negotiated closeness. She thought, he asked about my mother. She thought, powerful people ask about your circumstances when they want something from you. She also thought, he asked before I said anything about the appointment. He asked because he remembered I'd mentioned it 3 days ago. Eleanor Bennett's appointment went well, which in the context of her condition meant nothing had gotten worse, which was its own kind of victory. The doctor adjusted one of her medications slightly and recommended she avoid cold air when possible, which was ambitious advice for November in Chicago, but which Sophie noted and filed away for what it was worth. Her mother was quiet on the bus home, which meant she was tired, which meant Sophie didn't ask about what the doctor had said, even though she'd been present for all of it. Eleanor had a way of retreating after medical appointments. Not dramatically, not in a way that required management, just a particular internal stillness that Sophie had learned to give space. At home, while her mother napped, Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and did something she almost never did anymore, which was look Nathan Sterling up properly. Not the business magazine profile she vaguely remembered, not just the Sterling Workplace Solutions website. She looked at the longer pieces, a feature in a business journal from 2 years ago, an interview he'd given at a conference, the Wikipedia article that told the bare facts without the texture that made them mean anything. His wife's name had been Claire. She had died 4 years ago. The obituary Sophie found through a linked article gave the cause of death as a stroke, which had happened suddenly. She had been 31. Maya Sterling had been 3. Sophie closed her laptop and sat for a moment looking at the kitchen wall. She had known he was a single father, in the abstract way you know things about people when they mention them in passing. He'd mentioned Maya a few times in their conversations, the science project, a school pickup, a morning where Maya had required attention at 4:45 a.m. He mentioned his daughter, the way parents mention children who are so woven into the fabric of daily life that they surface naturally in any conversation, without prelude. He had never mentioned his wife. Sophie thought about that for a while, the way you think about a gap in a story. Not with intrusion, but with the particular quiet of recognizing something that is intentionally absent. She didn't bring it up when he called that evening. It was not hers to bring up. But she noticed in the conversation that followed, about the complaint channel language in Section 6, about what timely response needed to be defined as in legally enforceable terms, that she was listening to him differently than she had been. Not less carefully. Differently. With a kind of attention that went past the content of what he was saying and noticed how he said it, the places where he paused, the things he chose not to state directly. She recognized this, and she didn't particularly welcome it because she knew what it meant, and she was not in a position, financially or emotionally or practically, to mean anything new to anyone right now. She stayed focused on Section 6. The draft was better by the end of that call. The complaint channel definition was tighter, the enforcement language sharper. Nathan had pushed back on 2 of her points, and she'd held one and conceded the other, and at the end of it he'd said quietly, "This is the version that should go in front of the board." "Is it the version that will?" she asked. "I don't know yet. What's stopping you?" He was quiet for a moment, and she heard in the silence the particular quality of a person who was deciding how honest to be. "My advisors think if I bring the strong version forward and the board rejects it, I lose credibility on future policy proposals. The safer play is to bring forward the middle version, get it passed, and build toward the stronger version over time." "And what do you think?" "I think the safer play is exactly that. Safe. And I think safe and right are not always the same thing." "No," she said. "They're not. The problem is that if I lose this vote, I also potentially lose some board members who've been with this company since the beginning, which affects everything else we're trying to do." Sophie pulled her cardigan closer. The kitchen was cold. The radiator in the apartment had been intermittent all week, and the building super had been promising to look at it for 4 days. She'd put a folded towel against the bottom of the back door to stop the draft. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "I can't tell you what to put in front of your board. That's not my decision, and it's not my company." "I know. But I'll tell you this, the middle version of this policy will pass, and 5 years from now, some other woman at some other logistics company is going to send 17 documented complaints to her HR department and get the same non-responses I got, and some version of this policy will be on the books, and it won't have helped her at all. And the people who passed it will feel like they did something." The silence that followed was long. "I hear you," Nathan said. "Good. I said I hear you. I didn't say I know what I'm going to do." "I know," Sophie said. "I'm not asking you to." She could hear him breathing, not dramatically, just the quiet sound of a person on the other end of a phone line present. She had noticed that about him, the way he stayed on the line even in silence, didn't rush to fill it, didn't manufacture an ending to get off the phone. It was a small thing. "The board meeting is in 6 days, he said. "I know. I'll let you know what I decide." "Okay." There was a pause. "Sophie," he said. "Yeah." "The consulting fee. Will you take it?" She looked at the folded towel at the bottom of the door. She looked at the stack of her mother's medication bottles on the counter, the orange plastic kind with the white caps, lined up neatly in the order Eleanor took them. "Yes," she said. "I'll take it." "Good." He said it simply, without the satisfaction of someone who has won something, just the clean syllable of a decision settled. "It doesn't change what I think," she said. "I know that. About the policy or about you." "I know," he said. "That's why I asked." After they hung up, Sophie sat at the kitchen table for a while longer without opening her laptop. The radiator clicked and shuddered and emitted something that was not quite heat and not quite nothing. From the bedroom, she could hear the faint sound of her mother's television, the 6 o'clock news, which Eleanor watched every evening with the sound low in the way of a person who wants to stay connected to the world without being overwhelmed by it. Sophie thought about a man she had never met, who had a daughter who got up at 4:45 in the morning, and a policy draft with her annotations in the margins, and a board meeting in 6 days that he hadn't yet decided how to navigate. She thought about the specific weight of a decision that can't be walked back, the way certain choices narrow the road behind you permanently. She thought, he'll take the safe version. And then, almost immediately, I don't know if that's true. And that uncertainty, the specific, unfamiliar sensation of not being sure what someone would do in the moment of actual pressure, was itself something she hadn't felt in a long time. At Hartwell, she had always known. She had known from the first deflection in April what the outcome would be. She had kept sending the emails anyway because she needed to know she had tried, but she had known. She didn't know what Nathan Sterling would do in 6 days, and the fact that she didn't know meant something. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, but it meant something. The days between that conversation and the board meeting had a compressed, slightly unreal quality that Sophie would remember later as feeling like the last few days before a storm. Not the storm itself, which is loud and definable, but the specific atmospheric pressure of what precedes it, when the light is wrong and the air has a weight to it, and you find yourself listening for something you can't quite name. Nathan called every day. Not always for long. Sometimes it was 15 minutes to clarify a point in the revised draft. Sometimes it was longer and wandered past the policy into territory that was harder to categorize. He mentioned Maya's science project, which had pivoted from weather patterns to the effect of soil composition on plant growth, and which was apparently progressing in a way that had required the purchase of 6 small pots of dirt that now occupied the kitchen windowsill. He mentioned that his COO, Rachel, had reviewed the revised policy and called it aggressive, and then, when pressed, had admitted it was probably the right version. Sophie, for her part, mentioned her mother's improved lung function numbers, a freelance accounting job she'd picked up from a small restaurant group in Wicker Park, the fact that the building super had finally fixed the radiator, which was a victory that had taken 11 days and a written complaint to the building management company. These were not policy conversations. She noticed this without commenting on it. She filed it in the same place she had filed the question about her mother and the fact that he had read her letter twice and the way he laughed when she said something that landed. The involuntary laugh, not the managed one. On the fourth day, 2 days before the board meeting, he said something that she hadn't expected. "Rachel wants to meet you." Sophie paused. "Your COO. She says she's been reading your annotations on the draft for 2 weeks, and she'd like to put a face to the margin notes." "That's flattering." "It is, actually. Rachel doesn't say that kind of thing lightly. She called your enforcement language technically the only version that would survive a legal challenge from a determined plaintiff's firm, which from Rachel is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation." Sophie looked at her laptop screen. "I'm not looking for a job, if that's what this is." "It's not," Nathan said, and he said it without hesitation, which she noted. "I'm not going to try to hire you into a system you just got out of. Rachel asked, and I thought I'd pass it along." "Tell her I said thank you. You could tell her yourself." "Nathan, I know, too fast." "Too something," she said. He let it go. That was another thing she'd noticed. He knew when to let things go. In her experience, that was not a common quality. 2 days before the board meeting, Nathan sent her a calendar invite. She stared at it for a long moment. It was for an in-person meeting at the Sterling Workplace Solutions offices. The title of the invite was Policy Review, Pre-Board Preparation. There were 2 other names on it, Rachel Okafor and a man named David Chu, who, when she looked him up, turned out to be the company's lead policy attorney. There was nothing in the invite that required her to be there in person rather than by phone. There was no logistical reason that this meeting couldn't be a call, the way all of their previous conversations had been calls. She sat with the invite open in her browser for almost 10 minutes. Then she typed in the RSVP field, accepted. She took the bus to the West Loop at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, wearing her good blazer. The charcoal one she'd bought 4 years ago for a job interview and which still fit, but which she never wore because there had been very few occasions since that interview that had seemed to require it. She wore it with dark jeans and boots that had a small scrape on the toe of the left one that she'd tried to cover with shoe polish the night before with mixed results. She almost turned around twice. Once at the bus stop, when the bus was late and she stood in the cold for 7 minutes thinking about all the reasons this was a bad idea, and once in the lobby of Nathan's building, when she saw the words Sterling Workplace Solutions etched on a frosted glass panel above the elevator bank, and felt the particular discomfort of a person about to enter a world they don't belong in. She took the elevator anyway. Rachel Okafor was not what Sophie had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. She was a tall black woman in her early 40s, wearing a blazer that was objectively much better than Sophie's, and moving with the compressed efficiency of someone who ran a company and knew it and had stopped performing about it years ago. She met Sophie in the reception area with a handshake that was firm without being aggressive and a look that was direct without being rude. "The enforcement language in Section 6, Rachel said, before they had exchanged more than a greeting. "Walk me through your reasoning on the 72-hour response requirement." Sophie blinked. "Good morning to you too." Rachel almost smiled. "Good morning. The 72 hours. Longer than 72 hours and the initial complaint gets buried in process. Shorter than 72 hours, and companies can argue they didn't have adequate time to investigate a complex payroll system. 72 hours is enough time to pull and review payroll records for a single employee. It's not enough time to manufacture a rebuttal." Rachel looked at her for a moment. "Nathan said you were direct. Is that a problem?" "No," Rachel said. "It's a relief." They had the meeting in a conference room on the 3rd floor with windows that faced north, the ones Nathan had mentioned that caught the morning light off the lake in winter. Sophie noticed this without letting it distract her. David Chu, the policy attorney, was a compact man in his late 30s who had the slightly apologetic manner of a lawyer who was regularly required to tell people things they didn't want to hear and had found a way to do it that minimized the emotional damage without softening the content. Nathan arrived 3 minutes into the meeting, which Sophie suspected was intentional, giving her time to establish herself in the room before he walked in. She filed this thought away with some irritation because it implied he had been managing the situation, and she didn't like being managed. He was taller than she had somehow imagined him, which was an embarrassing thing to notice. He sat across from her and said, "You came. You invited me. I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," she said, and she meant it, and the honesty of it seemed to land correctly, because something in his expression relaxed slightly. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. They worked for 4 hours. It was different from the phone calls in the way that any conversation is different when you can see the other person. The ways that micro-expressions and posture carry information that voices alone don't. Sophie noticed that Nathan sat forward when he was genuinely engaged with a problem and leaned back when he was processing opposition. She noticed that he looked at her more than he looked at the document on the screen, which she told herself was because she was the one talking and not for any other reason. She noticed that when she made a point that David Chu initially resisted, the mandatory independent auditor requirement that the legal team had flagged as potentially opening the company to liability, Nathan waited for the full exchange before weighing in, and when he did, he sided with her. "She's right," he said. "If independent verification creates liability, that's a feature, not a bug. It means the verification is working." David made a note. Rachel didn't look surprised. At the end of the 4 hours, the policy was as close to what it should be as Sophie could see how to make it. It was not the middle version. It was the right version. The one with teeth. The one that would require companies to actually correct violations rather than simply document them. The one that an experienced plaintiff's attorney could use to hold someone accountable. It was also, as David noted on his way out, going to be a very interesting board meeting. After Rachel and David left the conference room, it was just Nathan and Sophie and the stack of annotated pages on the table between them and the north-facing windows, with the lake going silver in the early afternoon light. "You're going to bring this version," Sophie said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Nathan said. She looked at him. "What changed?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to questions that deserved seriousness. "Honestly, sitting across from you for 4 hours made it harder to pretend I didn't know what the right thing was." She wasn't sure what to do with that. She looked at the table. "That's my professional function, apparently," she said. "Among other things." She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize cleanly. Not the careful professional neutrality he wore most of the time, but something more unguarded, and she felt the specific unease of a person who has been seen more clearly than they planned for. "Nathan," she said. "I know," he said. "Not the right moment." "Not any moment," she said. "We're very different people in very different situations, and this is—" "Sophie." "What?" "I know," he said. And the way he said it, quietly, without argument, without the defensive packaging that most people wrapped around the things they didn't want to hear, told her that he did know, and that he was saying so honestly, and that he wasn't going to press it. She gathered her things. He walked her to the elevator. In the lobby, she turned up her collar against the cold she knew was waiting outside the building's revolving door, and she said, "Good luck on Friday." "Thank you." She pushed through the door. The November air hit her face, and she walked to the bus stop and stood there in the cold, her hands in her pockets, watching the bus approach from 2 blocks away. She was thinking about the way he had said, "I know," the specific register of it, the absence of self-pity or performance, the way a person says something when they mean it without any of the machinery of meaning it. The bus arrived. She got on. She found a seat by the window and watched the city move past and did not, for the rest of the ride home, think about very much at all, which meant, of course, that she was thinking about exactly one thing. The board meeting was in 2 days, and Nathan Sterling was going to walk into that room with the version of the policy that could cost him everything. And Sophie Bennett, who did not trust powerful people and had very good reasons not to, was going to spend those 2 days pretending she wasn't holding her breath. The night before the board meeting, Nathan didn't sleep. He didn't pretend to either, which was at least honest. He lay in his bed for an hour after Maya went down, staring at the ceiling with the particular alertness of a person whose brain has decided that sleep is not on the agenda and has moved on to other business. At 11:30, he got up, put on the clothes he'd left on the chair, and went to the kitchen. He made tea, which he didn't particularly want because making tea gave him something to do with his hands. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the specific nighttime geography of Chicago, the grid of lit windows in the buildings across the river, The red and white moving lights of traffic on the bridge below, the lake invisible in the dark, but present, the way large things are always present even when you can't see them. The policy document was on the kitchen table. He'd printed the final version that afternoon, after David had run through it one last time, and Rachel had read the whole thing in 40 minutes and said, with the economy she applied to everything, "This is what we should have written the first time." He sat down at the table and looked at it without opening it. He knew every page. He had read it enough times that he could navigate it by section number without looking at the headers. He knew where Sophie's language was, and where his own was, and where the two had become indistinguishable, which was more places than he had expected when they started. He thought about the board members he needed. 12 votes total, 7 required to pass. He had 4 that he was confident in, people who had been with Sterling Workplace Solutions since the early days, who understood what the company was supposed to be. He had 3 that were uncertain, experienced executives who supported the mission in principle, but managed significant investor relationships that complicated their positions. He had 5 that he was going to lose the moment he read Section 6 into the record. 7 minus 5 was 2, which meant he needed all 3 of the uncertain votes, and he needed them to hold under pressure. And he had spent the last 10 days making exactly the argument that pressure was coming. His phone was on the table beside the document. He looked at it. He did not call Sophie. It was 11:45 and she had a freelance deadline tomorrow morning, and her mother's medication pickup was in the afternoon, and he had no right to make that call at this hour for the purpose of hearing her voice, which was the only real purpose it would have served. He had told her 2 days ago, sitting in the conference room with the lake going silver in the windows, that the moment was wrong. He had meant it. He also understood, sitting alone in his kitchen at midnight, that meaning something and being able to stop thinking about it were different operations entirely. He thought instead about what he was going to do in 9 hours. He thought about the version of himself that would walk into that boardroom and present the safe draft, the one the lawyers preferred, the one the uncertain board members could vote for without losing sleep, the one that would pass cleanly and earn him a moment of institutional goodwill he could use on the next fight. That version was not cowardice exactly. It was strategy. It was the argument Rachel had made in the early weeks before Sophie's annotations had moved her. You can't fix everything in one vote, and losing badly sometimes costs you the next fight too. He thought about the version of himself that had read Sophie's letter on a Tuesday morning and felt, for the first time in months, like someone had said the true thing out loud. He opened the document to Section 6. He read it. He already knew it. He read it again anyway. In cases where independent verification identifies wage discrepancies affecting one or more employees, the responsible entity shall undertake mandatory corrective action within 30 days of verified finding. Corrective action shall include full restitution of withheld wages, documented system correction, and written notification to all affected employees. Voluntary disclosure does not substitute for independent verification and does not limit corrective action requirements. Sophie had written most of this paragraph. He had tightened the language on the corrective action timeline. David had argued against the 30 days. Too short for complex payroll systems, he said. Sophie had said, if 30 days is too short to correct a problem you caused, that's information about how seriously you take it. They had kept the 30 days. Nathan closed the document and sat back. He thought about Maya, asleep in her room with the small nightlight that projected constellations on the ceiling, a habit she'd started after Claire died, and which she had never stopped, though she was now 7 and wouldn't admit to needing it if asked directly. He thought about what it meant to build something and then put it at risk deliberately, and whether that was courage or ego or some uncomfortable combination of both. He thought about a woman he had spoken to every day for 3 weeks, who lived in a small apartment with a radiator that worked intermittently and $63 that had become $217, and who had spent 6 years sending documented truth into institutional silence without once, as far as he could tell, becoming cynical about the truth itself. Just about the institutions. He did not think he was in love with her. He was careful about this assessment because he was aware that he was a lonely man and that loneliness had a way of attaching significance to connection that was real but perhaps not that particular kind of real. He had been lonely since Claire, in the specific way of a person who has built a competent life around a large absence and learned to function within it without filling it. Maya was not the absence. Maya was everything. Maya was the reason the day had a shape. But Maya was 7 and could not be his whole answer to the question of what an adult life was supposed to feel like. He had told Sophie it wasn't the right moment. He had meant that. What he had not said, because it would have been both true and irrelevant, was that there was something in the way she argued, the specific directness of it, the absence of performance, the way she held a position because she had arrived at it through evidence rather than because she needed to be right, that felt, uncomfortably and without invitation, like the thing he had been trying to articulate in workplace policy frameworks for 5 years. The difference between institutional principle and actual principle. The difference between the document that says the right thing and the person who means it. He put his teacup in the sink. He went back to bed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city outside, and eventually, sometime after 1 a.m, slept. The Sterling Workplace Solutions boardroom was on the top floor, which Nathan rarely used. It had the particular atmosphere of rooms that are used infrequently for high-stakes purposes. Formal, slightly cold, with the sense that the air itself was aware of what went on here. A long oval table, 12 chairs, a projector screen on the north wall, a catering setup along the east wall that his assistant had arranged, and that nobody was going to touch. By 9:50, 11 of the 12 board members were seated. The 12th, Gerald Park, arrived at 9:58 with the practiced lateness of a man who had decided long ago that arriving last was a form of authority. He was 64, silver-haired, one of the company's original angel investors, and he had, in Nathan's experience, 3 settings: enthusiastic support, strategic caution, and immovable opposition. This morning, he was in caution mode. Nathan could see it in the way he arranged his materials and made brief eye contact around the table without committing to any of it. Rachel was at the far end of the table with a laptop and a legal pad, which meant she was prepared to take notes and also prepared to intervene if the legal questions got into territory that needed management. David Chu was not in the room. His presence had been deemed, after consideration, to be more alarming than reassuring. He was available by phone. Nathan stood at the head of the table with the printed policy in front of him and the projector showing the cover page, Transparency Standard, Final Draft, Sterling Workplace Solutions, November 2024, and looked at the people in the room. He knew most of them well. He had built this company with some of them. He had argued with all of them at some point. He was about to give several of them a very bad morning. "I want to start by being transparent about something," he said, and he heard distantly that he was using Sophie's word. "The draft I'm presenting today is not the version we discussed at the October preliminary review." The room shifted. Not dramatically. These were experienced people who knew how to manage their reactions, but he felt it, the particular atmospheric change of a group of people recalibrating. The October draft included a voluntary disclosure mechanism in Section 4.2 that allowed companies to self-report wage violations in lieu of mandatory independent verification. "I've removed that mechanism from the final draft." Gerald Park set his pen down. "Nathan, I'll take questions after the full presentation. This is, Gerald." Nathan said it quietly, but with enough weight that Park stopped. "After the presentation." He went through it section by section. He did not rush. He did not soften the enforcement language or apologize for the independent verification requirement or understate the implications of the 30-day corrective action timeline. He read the document as written, including Section 6, including the paragraph that Sophie had drafted and that he had kept unchanged because there was no better version of it. The room got progressively quieter in the way rooms do when people are managing escalating reactions. The specific silence of contained opposition, which is louder in its way than actual noise. When he finished, there was a moment of genuine quiet. Then Gerald Park said, "This is not the policy we agreed to develop." "No," Nathan said, "it isn't. The voluntary disclosure mechanism was specifically designed to create the appearance of accountability without the substance of it," Nathan said. "I know, that was the design. I'm not willing to pass something designed that way." "Nathan," this was from Vivian Cole, a board member who ran a private equity group and who was one of the uncertain votes. Someone Nathan had spent 2 weeks carefully cultivating. Her voice was not angry. It was measured, which was worse. I want to make sure I understand what I'm reading in Section 6. You're proposing that any company subject to this standard, including companies in our portfolio, would be required to undergo independent payroll audits. Yes. And that voluntary disclosure, proactive reporting of discrepancies, provides no protection from mandatory correction requirements. Correct? Do you understand what that means for our investor relationships? Yes, Nathan said. I do. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Do you understand that this essentially makes the standard adversarial to the companies we need to implement it? It makes it adversarial to companies that are manipulating wages, Nathan said. That's not a flaw. That's the point. The room erupted, which was not quite the right word. It was more that the contained opposition stopped being contained. 3 people were talking at once. Gerald Park was speaking in the specific measured register of a man who is very angry and has decided that demonstrating control is more effective than demonstrating anger. Vivian had stopped talking and was now writing something on her legal pad. 2 board members Nathan had expected to lose immediately were already shaking their heads. Rachel, at the far end of the table, was not writing anything. She was watching Nathan with the careful attention of someone who had already made her own decision about what was happening and was now simply observing the execution of it. Nathan waited for the noise to reduce to a manageable level. Then he said, I want to read something into the record. Nathan, Gerald started. It's brief. Nathan picked up a single page he had placed under the policy document. He had typed it that morning at 5 a.m., sitting at his kitchen table in the dark. This is an excerpt from a communication I received that informed the final draft of this policy. I want the board to understand where this language came from and why I consider it to be correct. He read Sophie's paragraph. Not all of it, just the part about Carl Whitmore's daughter starting college, and the dispatch workers whose overtime hours disappeared between recording and payment, and the sentence about sending 17 documented complaints over 6 months and receiving nothing but increasingly sophisticated deflections. He did not name her. He would not name her without her permission. He said only that it was from a worker in the logistics industry who had experienced the specific failure modes that the voluntary disclosure mechanism would perpetuate. When he finished reading, the room was quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Gerald Park picked up his pen. That's a compelling piece of writing, he said, and his tone suggested that he meant this as a criticism, that Nathan had introduced emotion into a policy discussion where it didn't belong. It's not meant to be compelling, Nathan said. It's meant to be accurate. It's someone's personal account of, it's consistent with documented findings from the Department of Labor over the last 7 years, Rachel said, from the end of the table, and she opened her laptop and turned it to face the room. I've pulled the relevant reports if you'd like to review them. Gerald looked at Rachel. You support this version? I support accurate policy, Rachel said. Yes. The vote happened at 11:40. Nathan had known, going in, that he needed 7 of 12. He'd run every permutation in his head the night before, in the dark hours before sleep. The final count was 5 in favor, 7 against. Nathan sat with the number for a moment after the board secretary announced it, 5-7. He had lost by 2 votes. The 2 he'd lost from the uncertain column, Vivian Cole and a board member named Harrison, who ran a manufacturing consortium, had gone the way he'd feared, which he had predicted, but had not, apparently, fully absorbed until the moment it was confirmed. The room moved on to the next agenda item with the efficiency of a group of people who wanted to demonstrate that the outcome had been clean and procedural and not personal. Nathan let them move through it. He answered questions when asked. He did not visibly demonstrate what he was feeling, which was a complicated mixture of things he didn't have time to inventory right now. After the meeting, Rachel caught up with him in the hallway. 5 votes, she said. Yes. You got Vivian on the preliminary review and lost her in the room. I know. The Park vote was always going to go the way it went. I know. Rachel walked beside him in silence for a moment. For what it's worth, she said, I think it was the right call. Nathan looked at her. That's not going to make the next board meeting easier. No, she said. It's not. But it's still the right call. She paused. What are you going to do? Tonight? With the policy, with the standard. Nathan pushed through the stairwell door. They went down the stairs because he needed to be moving, needed the physical fact of descent after 2 hours of sitting in a room that felt like it was getting smaller. I don't know yet, but I'm not done with it. The board will expect you to bring the middle version next quarter. I know what the board will expect. Nathan, Rachel stopped on the landing. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that whatever you decide, you need to decide it clearly and not in the next 4 hours. He nodded. I know. Go home. See Maya. Think about it tomorrow. He did go home. He picked Maya up from school at 3:15, which he almost never managed on a workday, and she was surprised and pleased in the specific way of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't care about things that matter to her. She talked about the soil experiment for the entire walk home. The roots were showing in the pot with the sandy mixture, which she had correctly predicted, and Ms. Fraser had said her hypothesis was well supported, which Maya reported with the particular satisfaction of a child who has been right about something and has the documentation to prove it. Nathan listened. He asked about the other pots. He helped with homework at the kitchen table and made pasta for dinner because it was what Maya wanted and he was not going to argue about it tonight. He put her to bed at 8:30 with the constellation nightlight throwing its faint scatter of fake stars on the ceiling, and he sat in the living room afterward with his phone on the cushion beside him. He needed to call Sophie. He was also aware that the call he wanted to make and the call he should make were not entirely the same call. The call he wanted to make started with her voice, which he had not heard since Wednesday, and ended somewhere he hadn't let himself map. The call he should make was about the board meeting, the outcome, the next steps for the policy. He called her. She picked up on the third ring, which meant she had seen his name and taken a second to decide. How did it go? She asked, because she already knew something had gone wrong from the fact that he was calling at 8:30 in the evening instead of the morning. 5 to 7, he said. A pause. You lost. Yes. The full version. Yes. Another pause, longer. He heard in the background the faint sound of Eleanor's television. I'm sorry, Nathan. Don't be. I knew going in what the likely outcome was. Knowing the likely outcome and losing are different things. Yes, he said. They are. She was quiet for a moment. He had learned to read her silences. This one was the thinking kind, not the processing kind. She was working through something. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know yet. Rachel says I need to decide tomorrow and not tonight. Rachel's right. I know. What did the room feel like when you read the excerpt? He had wondered if she would ask this. He had wondered, before the call, how much of what happened in the boardroom he was going to tell her. He had decided, while Maya was telling him about the sandy soil pot on the walk home, that he was going to tell her all of it. Quiet, he said. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind where people are managing their reactions. Did they know it was mine? No, I didn't use your name. Good. She said it quickly. He understood why. She was a woman who had just left a job for reporting the truth, who had a sick mother and a freelance income, who did not need her name attached to a boardroom confrontation at a company she had no formal relationship with. I wouldn't have used it without asking you, he said. I know, she said. I know you wouldn't. They were quiet for a moment together. The specific quiet of two people on a phone line who are not in the same city, but are in the same moment. Nathan, Sophie said. Yeah. I need to tell you something. He went still. There was something in her voice, a register he hadn't heard from her before, something that was pulling in two directions at once. There's going to be a story, she said, in the Meridian Business Chronicle. I got a call this evening from a journalist named Kate Ellison. She said she's working on a piece about the board meeting. Nathan sat up. How does she know about the board meeting? She knows about the policy. She knows about the vote. And she says, Sophie stopped. He heard her take a breath, the particular breath of someone about to say something they don't want to say. She says she has a source inside your company who told her you used a personal letter from a former employee to influence the board. And she says she has a copy of what she's calling the leaked resignation letter. The room felt different suddenly. Sophie. She read me a paragraph, Nathan. It's mine. It's word for word. How did she get it? I don't know. She said her source indicated you distributed it as part of a PR strategy ahead of the vote. That's not. He stopped. He was very careful about his next words. Sophie, I did not give that to anyone. I read one paragraph in the boardroom without your name into the official record. That's it. Silence. Sophie. I hear you. Her voice was different now. The warmth that had been in it 3 seconds ago was not gone exactly, but it had moved behind something. A caution, a distance, the kind that comes when someone has been reminded of why they maintain distance. I didn't leak your letter, he said. Someone at your company apparently did. I know, and I'm going to find out who. Kate Ellison is filing the story tomorrow morning. The headline is going to be something like, Billionaire uses worker's private letter as policy prop. Nathan, my name is in it. I'll call her tonight. Don't. Sophie's voice was quiet and very flat. Don't call the journalist tonight. Don't try to manage this with me as the subject. Sophie, I'm serious. There was something in her voice now that he recognized from the early conversations. The Sophie who had spent 6 years watching powerful people protect their interests and had learned to identify the moment when that protection started happening. I need to think about this. I need to think about whether she stopped. Whether what? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing words precisely because they don't trust themselves to be precise without choosing. Whether I was right to be cautious about this from the beginning, she said. Whether the thing I was afraid of at the start, that a powerful person would take something true and use it for something I didn't control, whether that's what happened. It isn't what happened. You used my words in a boardroom full of investors and executives without asking me first. The sentence landed the way it was meant to, accurately. You're right, he said. I should have asked you. Yes, you should have. I'm sorry. She was quiet. I'm not saying I don't believe that you didn't leak it, she said finally. I'm saying I don't know what I think yet. And I need to not talk to you right now because I am very tired and very angry, and I know from experience that tired and angry is not the mental state in which I make my best assessments. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Good night, Nathan. She hung up. He sat in his living room for a long time after, with his phone in his hand and the city doing its nighttime work outside the windows. He felt the specific weight of something he had not protected well enough. Not the policy, not the vote, but something more fragile and less replaceable. He thought about who had access to the letter. Him, Rachel, his assistant, who had been in the office when he first read it, and who had, almost certainly, seen the sender name. He thought about the 11 days between the day he'd received it and the board meeting, all the people who moved through the offices of Sterling Workplace Solutions in 11 days. He thought about Sophie's voice in those last 30 seconds. The specific quality of a trust that is not destroyed but is held at arm's length, waiting to see what the next move would be. The story ran the next morning, just as she had said it would. Kate Ellison's piece in the Meridian Business Chronicle ran under the headline, Sterling's Failed Vote. Did Billionaire use workers' private resignation letter as boardroom theater? It was 3,000 words. It was, Nathan could see even in his anger, well reported. The kind of piece where the journalist had done real work, had multiple sources, and had made a genuine attempt at balance that nonetheless arrived at a conclusion that was damaging regardless of the nuance. The piece named Sophie. It quoted from her letter at length. It characterized Nathan's use of the excerpt in the boardroom as a calculated publicity move, a way to humanize an aggressive policy position ahead of a vote that his own advisors had told him was likely to fail. His phone started before 7 a.m. Rachel called first, then his communications director, a woman named Brianna who handled media relations and whose voice had the specific compression of a person containing panic, then Gerald Park, who was not containing anything. This is a disaster, Gerald said. I know. The woman in that story is going to... Her name is Sophie Bennett, Nathan said, and she didn't authorize any of this. Someone in our organization leaked her letter. I want to know who. That's a secondary concern right now. The primary concern is It is not a secondary concern, Nathan said. Someone gave a private communication sent to this company by mistake to a journalist. That is a serious breach of confidence, and it directly harmed someone who had nothing to do with any of this. That is my primary concern. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Nathan, the board is going to want a statement. I'll give a statement. It will be the truth. I would strongly recommend letting Brianna draft. I'll give a statement, Nathan said. It will be the truth. He hung up. He sat at his desk. He thought about what Sophie had said. Tired and angry is not the mental state in which I make my best assessments. He recognized the wisdom of this. He was both things right now. He called Rachel. I need to find out who had access to that email, he said. I'm already working on it, Rachel said. My best guess is your assistant or someone on his team. The email came through your general contact address, and his team handles triage. Find out. I will. Nathan. A pause. Have you talked to Sophie? Last night, before the story ran. How is she? He thought about her voice, the distance that had appeared in it. Not well. Do you want me to reach out to her directly? No, he said. Don't. This needs to come from me. He spent the morning managing the immediate fallout, not the boardroom consequences, which were real and would need attention, but the specific harm of Sophie's name being in that story, her private words being treated as content. He instructed Brianna to issue a statement making clear that the communication had been received in error, that it had been read by him personally and used with the intent of illustrating a real workplace experience, and that it had been shared with no one outside the company and had been leaked without his knowledge or authorization. He included a line that Brianna argued against. The person whose words I read in that boardroom was right about everything she described. The policy failed not because she was wrong, but because institutional interests and the workers those institutions employ are still treated in too many rooms as separate concerns. That gap is what this standard was designed to close. Brianna said it was too personal. Nathan said publish it. But Sophie had already read the story before any of it was published. She had read it at 6:47 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her first coffee before her mother was awake, in the particular cold quiet of an early morning when the news arrives and you are alone with it. She read her own name. She read her own words, stripped of their context and reframed as the contents of a billionaire's policy strategy. She read the word theatrical applied to Nathan's use of her letter, and felt, underneath the anger, the specific shame of a person who has been exposed against their will, not their body, but something more intimate than that. The specific truth she had written in a moment of exhaustion and loss, the words she had not chosen carefully because she hadn't been writing for an audience. She put her phone face down on the table. She stared at the kitchen wall. Her mother appeared in the doorway at 7:15, wrapped in the blue cardigan, and took one look at Sophie's face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing," Sophie said. "An article." Eleanor came into the kitchen and poured herself water and stood at the counter reading the story on Sophie's phone when Sophie slid it across the table without a word. Her mother read it in silence. "He didn't leak it," Eleanor said when she finished. Sophie looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because leaking it doesn't help him. The story makes him look bad. The story makes him look like someone who builds his policy arguments on poor women's misfortune," Sophie said, and she heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't try to sand it off. "That's not the same thing as what actually happened." "I know that, Mom." "Do you?" Sophie stood up and took her cup to the sink. "I don't know what I know right now." Eleanor said nothing. She had the particular wisdom of a woman who understood the difference between moments that needed words and moments that needed silence, and she had raised a daughter who needed, in her worst moments, primarily to be left alone to work through things rather than manage through them. Sophie spent the day not calling Nathan back. She wasn't deciding not to. She just wasn't ready. And she had learned in 6 years at Hartwell that the most dangerous thing you could do was respond to something while you were still too angry to think clearly. She picked up her mother's prescription. She worked on the restaurant group's quarterly accounts. She took the bus to the library and back, which was something she did sometimes when she needed the particular solace of being around books and other quiet people without any obligation to speak. On the bus home at 4:30 in the afternoon, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize. "My name is Rachel Okafor. I'm Nathan Sterling's COO. I want to be clear that I'm texting you on my own initiative, not his. He asked me not to reach out. I'm doing it anyway because I think you should know. We've identified the source of the leak." It was a junior associate on our communications team who had access to the email as part of a standard inbox triage process. He's been terminated. Nathan is issuing a correction statement this afternoon that includes a direct statement of support for your position on the policy. He's also drafting a personal letter to you that he'll send when he thinks you're ready to receive it. I don't know if any of that matters to you right now, but I thought you should know. Sophie read the text twice. She typed back, "Thank you for telling me." She put her phone in her pocket. Outside the bus window, the November light was already going. The early dark falling at 4:30 the way it does in the Midwest in late autumn, the sky going orange at the edges, and then blue, and then a deep, colorless gray that is not quite night but is no longer day. She thought, he asked her not to reach out. She thought, she did it anyway because she thought I should know. She thought about the specific calculus of a person deciding that truth was more important than instruction, and she recognized it, and it landed in a place that was already tender. She did not call Nathan, not that night, but she stopped holding her breath the way she had been holding it since 6:47 that morning, and she sat on the bus in the early dark and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the anger and the specific humiliation of having your private truth treated as public property, something she hadn't quite expected. She felt the question that the day had been building toward, the one she hadn't let herself fully form. Not what did he do, but what does he do next? And she didn't know the answer yet, but she was, for the first time in a difficult day, paying attention. 3 days passed before Sophie called him back. Not because she had decided anything in particular during those 3 days, more because she needed the specific distance of 72 hours to sort through what she actually felt versus what she was reacting to. And she had learned, mostly the hard way, that those two things required different amounts of time. She spent those days working, the restaurant group's quarterly accounts, a one-time bookkeeping job for a small architecture firm that a former colleague had referred her way. She cleaned the apartment with the particular focused energy of a person who is thinking hard about something and needs her hands to be doing something unrelated while her brain works. She took her mother to the pharmacy. She read, at night, when Eleanor was asleep and the apartment was quiet. Not anything heavy, just the detective novel her mother had left on the kitchen table and which Sophie had picked up without intention and then kept reading because it asked nothing of her except attention to plot. On the second evening, she read Nathan's correction statement online. It had been published the morning after the Chronicle piece, and she had known about it from Rachel's text, but she hadn't read it until now. She read it the way she read most things, carefully, looking for the gap between what it said and what it meant. There was no gap she could find. He had said she was right. Not a worker raised valid concerns, or the letter reflected real experiences in the industry. He had said, in a formal public statement, that the person whose words he'd read in the boardroom was right about everything she had described. He had named the policy failure clearly and not defensively. He had not, at any point in the statement, made himself the subject of what he was saying. She read the last paragraph twice. "The leak of this communication was a breach of confidence for which I am responsible, regardless of who executed it. I should have asked permission before using any portion of this person's words in a formal proceeding. I did not. That was wrong, and I regret it." She sat with this. The specific thing about Nathan Sterling, she was beginning to understand, was that he was a person who could be wrong without making his wrongness into a performance of humility that was actually about getting credit for admitting the wrongness. He just said it, clearly. And then moved on to what needed to happen next. She had encountered very few people in her life who could do that. On the third day, at 10 in the morning, she called him. He answered on the first ring. "Hi," he said. Just that. "Hi," she said. A beat. "I read your statement," she said. "Okay." "It was good, honest." "It was accurate," he said, which was his way of saying the same thing. Sophie was standing at the kitchen window. Outside, the sky was doing the heavy, low thing it did in Chicago before snow. Not quite dark, just dense, the clouds the color of old concrete. "I'm not fully over being angry," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "That's fair. But I also believe you didn't leak it." "I didn't." "I know." She paused. "I think I knew the night you told me. I was just too... The article came out and my name was in it, and it was early in the morning, and I wasn't..." She stopped. "Sophie, you don't have to explain it. I want to, because I said something to you that implied I didn't trust you, and the truth is more complicated than that. I do trust you. I'm just not very good at it, trusting people." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. She had stopped finding his silences uncomfortable sometime in the second week of October, which was itself an observation she filed away. "I know," he said. "You have good reasons for that. Doesn't make it easier to manage." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She turned away from the window and leaned against the counter. "Tell me what's happening with Hartwell." "You saw the Department of Labor filing." "I saw a news item. I didn't know the details." "An anonymous complaint triggered a formal investigation 2 weeks ago. The scope expanded pretty quickly once investigators got into the payroll system. They're finding..." He paused. "Sophie, they're finding everything you documented, and significantly more than that." She felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite vindication, because vindication implied she had needed to be proven right, and she had never doubted that she was right. It was something older and more complicated. The feeling of a truth that has spent a long time in the dark finally getting light on it. "Carl Whitmore," she said. "I was going to get to that. His termination is part of the investigation now. The documentation suggests it was a retaliatory firing." She closed her eyes for a second. "He has a daughter starting college." "I know," Nathan said. "I read your letter." She opened her eyes. "What's going to happen to Henderson? Gary specifically? Or the family? Both." "That's going to take time. These things always take longer than they should, but the investigators are serious about this one. The payroll manipulation was systematic enough and long-running enough that they're looking at potential fraud charges, not just compliance violations." Sophie thought about 6 years of carefully documented complaints. She thought about the 17 emails. She thought about Dennis Reese telling her it was a system error, and Gary Henderson sending her vague non-answers, and Marcus Henderson being drunk by noon on Fridays, while the people in the loading dock worked overtime hours that were recorded internally and vanished from their paychecks. "Someone filed an anonymous complaint," she said. "Do you know who?" A pause that was almost too short to notice. "I have some sense of it." "Was it you?" "I'm not in a position to confirm that," Nathan said. Which was, she understood, his way of confirming it. She felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not in a way she wanted to examine closely right now, but a shift nonetheless. The recalibration of a person who has been bracing for disappointment and found something different. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you." "You wrote it all down," he said. 6 years ago you started writing it down. Everything that needed to happen afterward depended on that." "That's generous." "It's true." She looked at the ceiling for a second. Outside, the first snow of the season had started. She could see it through the window, small and tentative, the kind of first snow that doesn't commit to anything. "I need to tell you something else," Nathan said. "Okay." "I've been thinking about my position at Sterling." He said it carefully, with the specific care of someone who has made a decision and is still slightly surprised by it. "About what it means to run a company that advocates for workplace reform while operating within the same institutional structures that make reform difficult." Sophie went still. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the board meeting was clarifying, not just because we lost the vote, because of what the room felt like when we lost. I looked at the people who voted against this policy and I understood..." He paused. "I understood that some of them were going to vote against any version of this that had actual teeth, regardless of how we framed it, because actual teeth are contrary to their interests. And I can keep trying to work around that, or I can stop pretending that working around it is the same thing as fixing it. What does that mean practically? I'm stepping down from the CEO position. Sophie blinked. Nathan? Not from the company entirely. Rachel is the right person to run the institutional side of this. She always has been, frankly. She's better at the board management and the investor relationships than I am, and I've known that for a while. But the policy work, the actual framework development, I want to do that outside the corporate structure, where I don't have a board to answer to. You'd be walking away from the CEO position of a company you built. Yes. Nathan, that's a significant thing. I know what it is. He said it simply. I've thought about it for 10 days. It's what I want to do. Sophie was quiet. She was running calculations she hadn't meant to run, not financial ones, though those were real, but something more complicated. The specific calculation of what it meant when a person did something that cost them genuinely, not performatively. When the cost was real and they paid it anyway. What will you do? She asked. Outside the corporate structure. There are organizations doing this work at the state level. Independent policy institutes, worker advocacy groups. I've been in conversations with a few of them. And there's a foundation that wants to fund a dedicated labor standards research program. He paused. Your transparency standard, the real version, the one with teeth. I want to keep working on getting it adopted. It won't happen through Sterling's board, but it can happen other ways. It'll be slower. Probably. But it'll be real. Sophie turned to look out the window again. The snow was heavier now, actually committing. The first real snow of the season always changed something about the city, softened the edges of things, made the familiar look briefly unfamiliar. I want to keep working on it with you, Nathan said. The policy, if you're willing. As a consultant, as whatever you want to call it, as the person who understands it better than anyone I've worked with. She thought about the restaurant group's quarterly accounts. She thought about the architecture firm referral. She thought about the $63 that had become $217 that had become, after the consulting fee Nathan had paid her, something closer to actual breathing room. I need to think about that, she said. Take your time. I will. A beat. Sophie, he said. I know, she said before he could continue. Still not the right moment. I was going to ask if your mother's doing okay in the cold weather. Sophie felt the corner of her mouth move. She's fine. She's wearing 3 sweaters. Smart woman. Yes, Sophie said. She is. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow make its slow transformation of the alley below. She was thinking about a man who was going to voluntarily walk away from something he had spent 5 years building because he had concluded that staying inside it was incompatible with doing the work he actually wanted to do. She had never seen a powerful person do that before. Voluntarily, clearly, without drama. She had seen powerful people lose power. At Hartwell, she had watched the Henderson brothers make enough bad decisions over 6 years that the company had been quietly losing ground in 3 of its 4 regional markets. She had seen power compelled to change. She had never seen it chosen away from. She was still not sure what to do with the feeling that produced in her. She suspected she was going to need more time. She was also, she noticed, no longer counting anything. The investigation into Hartwell Regional Logistics moved faster than investigations usually did, which said something about how thoroughly Sophie had documented things over 6 years, and how cooperative Carl Whitmore turned out to be once the Department of Labor investigators contacted him. Carl called Sophie in the second week of December. She hadn't expected to hear from him. They had been friendly at Hartwell, the specific work friendship of 2 people who respected each other's competence and shared the kind of professional trust that comes from being on the same side of a situation neither of them had chosen. But they hadn't kept in touch after his firing. She had felt guilty about that, in the vague, ongoing way of someone who knows they should have called and didn't. Sophie. His voice was the same, deep, direct. The voice of a man who had spent 11 years managing a loading dock and had developed, out of professional necessity, an economy with words. You did this. Carl. I'm not saying it to put it on you. I'm saying it because those investigators walked into my house with a file that was built on 6 years of documentation, and whoever put that file together, it wasn't me. I only kept records for about 8 months. I had 6 years of records, Sophie said. Yeah, a pause. My daughter's college situation looks a lot better than it did 2 months ago. There's going to be back pay for a lot of people. And Gary Henderson had his personal accounts frozen yesterday. Sophie sat down at the kitchen table. I didn't know about the accounts. It's not public yet. The investigator told me off the record. Another pause. You okay? I saw that article. In the Chronicle. I'm okay. The Sterling thing. He didn't leak it, did he? It wasn't a question. Carl had the same instinct Sophie had. The instinct of a person who has worked around institutional deflection long enough to recognize when something is the opposite of deflection. No, she said. He didn't. Good. Because that statement he put out, that was decent. That was a decent thing to put out. Yes, Sophie said. It was. After she hung up, she sat for a while with the specific weight of what Carl had said. My daughter's college situation looks a lot better. 6 years of documentation, 17 emails sent into silence, 1 resignation letter sent to the wrong address, a man who had read it twice. She thought, this is what it looks like when the thing works. Not cleanly, not in a way that undid everything that had happened, not in a way that gave Carl back the months he had spent unemployed, or that fully compensated the loading dock workers for years of stolen overtime. The investigation would do what investigations do, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular friction of institutional process. But it was happening. The records existed. The documentation held. She had believed in April, when she sent the first email to Dennis Reese, that documentation mattered. She had continued to believe it through 17 non-responses and a lateral transfer and an 8% pay cut. She had believed it, she now understood. The way a person maintains a belief that is costing them something real, not because it felt true, but because abandoning it would mean something about those 6 years that she wasn't willing to mean. It turned out to be true. That was not something she had fully allowed herself to count on. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway. Was that Nathan? Carl Whitmore, a man from Hartwell. Her mother nodded slowly. Good news? Some of it. Eleanor sat down at the table across from her. She was having a better week. The adjusted medication was helping, and the cold that had settled into Chicago in December had not yet complicated her lungs the way it sometimes did. She looked at her daughter with the specific attention of a woman who has watched her daughter carry things alone for a long time and has learned when to say something and when to be quiet. You should call him, Eleanor said. Sophie looked up. Mom. I'm just saying what I observe. I'm aware of what you observe. You observe it loudly. I observe it quietly, Eleanor said. I'm saying it loudly now because it seems like you've been making yourself not think about it, and I thought someone should say it out loud so you could hear it and decide it was wrong or right. It's complicated. Most things worth doing are. He's a billionaire who is currently stepping down from the company he built, which means he's making a major life decision in the middle of a very chaotic period, which is not exactly the ideal. Sophie, her mother said, what? Is he a good person? Sophie looked at the table. I think so. Do you trust him? Mostly. Is mostly enough? I don't know. Eleanor put her hand on the table, not touching Sophie's, but close. You have spent 6 years being right about things that cost you. You were right about Hartwell. You were right about the policy. You have been right about a lot of things that the world was slow to catch up to. She paused. I'm your mother. I'm going to tell you to also be right about this. Sophie looked at her mother for a long moment. Eleanor Bennett, 68 years old, 3 sweaters, lungs like crumpled paper, and the particular clarity of a woman who has arrived at the age where she no longer has much use for anything except the truth. I'll think about it, Sophie said. You've been thinking about it, her mother said. That's different from doing something about it. The formal announcement of Nathan's resignation from the Sterling Workplace Solutions CEO position came on a Wednesday in mid-December, which was the same day, unrelated, though the timing produced some ironic headlines, that the Department of Labor issued its preliminary findings on Hartwell Regional Logistics. The Hartwell findings were extensive. The report documented systematic payroll manipulation affecting 47 employees across 4 departments over a period of not 6 years, but 9, 3 years before Sophie had started working there. The manipulation included falsified overtime records, improper benefit deductions, and what the report characterized as a deliberate and coordinated effort to suppress internal complaints through retaliatory personnel actions, of which Carl Whitmore's firing was one of 6 identified cases. Gary Henderson and Dennis Reese were named in the findings. Richard Henderson, the oldest brother who had spent the period in Palm Beach, was included in a subsidiary finding about executive awareness and inaction. Marcus Henderson, the one who was drunk by noon on Fridays, had apparently been the one to design the original manipulation scheme, a fact that Sophie absorbed with the particular weariness of someone who is not surprised but is still disappointed by the specific shape of the confirmation. The report was covered by 7 major news outlets by the end of that Wednesday. 3 of them referenced Sophie's resignation letter, now a matter of public record through the Chronicle piece, as an early indication of the pattern. One of them, a labor reporter for a national publication who had clearly done her own research, noted that Sophie's internal complaint documentation had been provided to investigators and described it as remarkably thorough. Remarkably thorough. Sophie read that twice, sitting at the kitchen table, and felt something complicated. Not pride exactly, but something in that neighborhood that was also adjacent to grief. 6 years of careful documentation, 17 emails, a letter sent to the wrong address. Remarkably thorough. Nathan's resignation announcement ran in the same news cycle, which meant the 2 stories got briefly tangled in the coverage, several outlets noting that Sterling had championed the transparency standard, that the standard had failed its board vote, that Hartwell's investigation demonstrated exactly the kind of systemic manipulation the standard was designed to address. A few pieces drew a direct line from Sophie's letter to Nathan's boardroom, from Nathan's boardroom to the DOL investigation, in a way that was slightly reductive but not entirely wrong. Nathan called her that evening. "How are you handling the coverage?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said. "It's strange to have your name in things. I'm used to being the person who documents the thing, not the person who's documented." The labor reporter's piece was good. It was accurate. That's more important than good. "Are you getting calls?" "A few. I'm not answering them." She paused. "How are you handling yours?" "Better than yesterday," he said, "which was better than the day before." A pause. "Maya asked me this morning why I wasn't going to the office." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was changing jobs." "How did she take it?" "She asked if the new job still had a coffee machine because she likes the one at the office." Sophie felt the corner of her mouth move. "That's the important question." "She's very practical." "She sounds it." There was a pause, comfortable, the way their pauses had been for weeks, but with something slightly different in it tonight. Something that had been adjacent to what it actually was for a long time and was now closer. "Sophie," Nathan said. "Nathan," she said, "I'd like to see you." She was quiet. "Not as a business meeting," he said. "Not about the policy, just, I'd like to see you. In person, if that's something you'd consider." She looked at the window. Outside it was snowing again, the second real snow of the season, heavier than the first. The city below was muffled, its sounds softened the way city sounds always are when snow is falling. "When?" she said. He made a sound, something between surprise and relief, quickly contained. "Whenever you want." "After Christmas," she said. "Things are calmer after Christmas." "After Christmas," he said. "Yes." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She could hear, even through the phone, the change in his breathing, the specific exhale of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. She recognized it because she could feel something similar happening in her own chest, a loosening of a tension she had been maintaining for so long she had stopped noticing it as tension. "How's your mother?" he asked. "Wearing 3 sweaters and watching the evening news and telling me what to do." "Is she right?" Sophie looked toward the hallway where the faint sound of Eleanor's television was its usual evening companion. "She usually is," she said. "It's extremely inconvenient." Nathan laughed. "The real one, not the managed one." She had cataloged the difference weeks ago. "I'll see you after Christmas, Sophie." "Yes," she said. "You will." The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Sophie didn't quite have a word for. Not waiting. She had spent too much of her life waiting, in the passive, heavy sense of the word, for things to change or resolve or become clear. This was different. Things were moving. Multiple things, on multiple tracks, in ways she was watching with the attention of a person who has spent 6 years learning to watch carefully. The Hartwell investigation deepened. A class action suit was filed on behalf of 39 of the 47 affected employees, and a labor attorney named Patricia Gaines, who had been working overtime cases in Chicago for 22 years and who had the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who wins more than she loses, reached out to Sophie directly. Not to represent her, Sophie's situation was legally different, but to ask if she would be willing to speak with the plaintiff's team about the internal documentation processes she had observed. Sophie said yes. She drove to Patricia Gaines' office on a Thursday morning in late December and sat across from a 60-year-old attorney who had the organized desk of someone who believed in systems and the wall-to-wall filing cabinets of someone who had been doing this long enough to have accumulated a significant number of systems worth of material, and talked for 2.5 hours about what she had seen and documented at Hartwell over 6 years. At the end of it, Patricia Gaines folded her hands on the desk and said, "You documented this better than most people we work with who are being actively advised by an attorney." "I didn't have an attorney," Sophie said. "I know," Patricia said. "That's what makes it impressive, and somewhat horrifying that you needed to." "Yes," Sophie said. "It is." She took the bus home. She sat by the window and watched the December Chicago passing outside, the storefronts with their holiday decorations, the people in their coats moving with the specific purposefulness of the cold weather walk, the brief glimpses of the lake between buildings as they moved east. She thought about the class action plaintiffs. She thought about names she had seen in the payroll records over 6 years, names attached to the discrepancies she had documented, people who had worked overtime and had that overtime quietly vanished, people who had signed up for benefits that were deducted but not delivered. She had never met most of them. They didn't know she had been fighting, quietly and badly and without any institutional support, for their money. She thought, maybe that's enough, not as a consolation, as an assessment. The 6 years had not been wasted. The documentation had held. The truth she had put into 17 emails and 1 misdirected resignation letter had found, eventually, the people who could do something with it. Not the way she would have designed the process. Not without cost. Not without Carl Whitmore's 11 months of unemployment and her own 8 months of financial terrification and a Chronicle story with her name in it before she was ready. But it had held. Nathan's first post-CEO initiative was announced in the 3rd week of December, a partnership with the Illinois Workers' Rights Institute to develop the transparency standard outside the corporate framework, funded partly by a foundation grant and partly, as the announcement noted without specifics, by private investment. Rachel Okafor had been named CEO of Sterling Workplace Solutions effective January 1st, which was, Sophie had come to understand, the outcome Rachel had been quietly competent enough for years, and which Nathan had been the structural obstacle to, not because he was unwilling to step aside, but because he hadn't yet seen clearly enough what stepping aside would make possible. He texted her the morning the announcement went live. "It's out." She texted back, "I saw. Rachel's going to be great. She already is," he wrote. "She always was." "I know," Sophie wrote back. A beat. Then, 2 more days until Christmas. She smiled at her phone. "Yes," she wrote, "I'm aware." "After Christmas," he wrote. "After Christmas," she confirmed. Eleanor was in the kitchen making tea when Sophie came back into the apartment and put her phone in her pocket. Her mother looked at her face, the careful, thorough look that mothers give daughters when they're reading something between the words, and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Sophie sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and pulled up the Transparency Standard draft. The real version, the one with teeth, the one she had argued into being over 3 weeks of phone calls and one afternoon in a conference room with north-facing windows. She had 3 ideas about the independent verification section that she'd been turning over for a week, and she wanted to write them down before she talked to Nathan about them, because she had learned that she argued better when she came in with the full thought already worked out. She wrote for an hour. The apartment was warm. The radiator had been behaving since November, a fragile piece she was trying not to take for granted. Her mother drank her tea and read a library book and occasionally made small sounds of disagreement with whatever the book was saying. Outside, the snow had stopped and the sky had the clean, cleared quality that follows heavy snow, the light off the white surface coming in bright and cold through the windows. Sophie wrote about independent verification. She wrote about what it needed to look like to actually function. She wrote in the clear, precise language she had developed over 6 years of documentation, the language she had used in 17 emails and 1 resignation letter and 61 pages of annotated policy, the language that had turned out, against every available evidence, to matter. She was not counting anything. She was not waiting. She was working, in a warm apartment on a December afternoon, on the thing that needed to be built, in the specific knowledge that it could be, and that she knew how. Outside, Christmas was 2 days away. After that, a new year. After that, whatever came next. She turned back to her draft and kept writing. Christmas came and went the way it does when you are an adult with complicated circumstances. Not badly, just quietly, with the specific texture of a holiday that is being held together by effort rather than effortlessness. Sophie made her mother's recipe for pot roast, which required 3 hours and a Dutch oven she borrowed from the neighbor across the hall, who never used it. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and directed operations with the authority of a woman who had made this dish 40 times and was not going to let it be made incorrectly simply because she was the one sitting down this year. They ate at the kitchen table with the good plates, the ones Sophie had bought at an estate sale 5 years ago because they were beautiful, and she had told herself she would use them for things that mattered. And they talked about small things. Eleanor's sister in Milwaukee, a movie they had both seen on television the week before. The way the snow on the rooftop across the alley had a particular blue quality in the late afternoon light. They did not talk about Nathan. Eleanor had said what she had to say about that, and understood, with the particular wisdom of a mother who knows her daughter, that saying it again would only make Sophie's stubbornness consolidate. Sophie called Nathan on Christmas evening at 7, after the dishes were done and Eleanor was settled with her book. She sat on the edge of her bed with the door half closed and her coat still on because the bedroom window had developed a draft that the building super had not yet addressed. "Merry Christmas," she said when he answered. "Merry Christmas." His voice was warm in a way that was different from his professional warmth, less constructed, more like a person who is simply glad to hear something. "How was it?" "Good. My mother supervised every step of the pot roast from a seated position. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than her doing it herself. Probably better for the pot roast. Definitely better for the pot roast." Sophie pulled her coat tighter. "How was yours?" Maya informed me at breakfast that Santa had gotten her wish list wrong in 2 specific ways, which she detailed in writing. She wrote it down. She presented it as a document, with a cover page. Sophie felt the laugh come up before she could manage it, and she let it, because it was Christmas, and the bedroom was cold, and the laugh was genuine. "She's 7. "She is intensely, specifically 7, Nathan said, and there was in his voice something that was not quite pride and not quite exasperation, and was exactly the thing that parents sound like when they are describing their children to someone they want to understand the whole of them. They talked for 40 minutes, about Maya's Christmas document and Eleanor's pot roast supervision and the specific quiet of a holiday when the world pauses for 24 hours and gives you space to notice what your life actually contains. They talked about the transparency standard and a call Nathan had scheduled with the Illinois Workers' Rights Institute for January 3rd and the independent verification framework Sophie had been drafting in the December afternoons. At the end of it, Nathan said, 2 days. 2 days, Sophie confirmed. "I'll text you in the morning." "Okay," she said. And then before she could decide not to, "Nathan, I'm glad you called. In October. I know you nearly didn't." A pause. "How do you know that?" Because I nearly didn't answer. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I nearly didn't. Good thing we both did. Yeah, he said. Good thing. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat in the cold bedroom and looked at the wall and felt for the first time in a long time that the immediate future was something she was approaching rather than bracing for. 2 days later, she took the bus to the lakefront. She had suggested it, meeting outside, which Nathan had agreed to without question or negotiation. She had her reasons, which she hadn't fully articulated even to herself, but which had something to do with the fact that most of the significant conversations she had had with him had happened in enclosed spaces, on the phone, in a conference room, through annotated documents, and she wanted, this time, the context of something larger. The lake in January was not comfortable, but it was honest. It asked nothing of you except acknowledgement. She got there first. She stood at the railing near the Riverwalk extension, where the path opened up to a wide view of the water, and pulled her scarf up against the wind. The lake was gray and serious, moving with the particular purpose of a large body of water in winter. Not hostile, just indifferent in a way that was its own kind of company. The sky was the color of unfinished concrete. 2 joggers passed behind her. A man with a dog stood further along the path, the dog investigating something at the base of the railing with complete absorption. She heard footsteps and turned. Nathan Sterling in person, she had established in November, was taller than she'd imagined and moved like someone who had been told many times that people were watching him and had decided not to let that change how he moved. Today, he was in a dark coat and no hat, which was impractical for January, and she made herself look directly at him rather than away, which was her instinct, like a person who has been through something and has come out the other side of it still standing but not unchanged. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued in the conference room. Unguarded, not performing anything. Hi, he said. You're not wearing a hat, she said. It's 12 degrees. I forgot it. How do you forget a hat in January in Chicago? I was thinking about other things. She turned back to the lake for a moment because it was easier than the alternative, and they stood side by side at the railing with the cold coming off the water and the city at their backs. I've been thinking about something, she said. Okay. About why I trusted you, eventually. She kept her eyes on the lake. It wasn't the policy work, even though that was real. It wasn't the statement you put out after the Chronicle piece, even though that mattered. She paused. It was that you were wrong about something, and you said so without making it a production. You just said it and meant it and moved on. The boardroom, he said, using your words without asking. Yes, most people in your position would have explained it, would have made sure I understood the reasoning before they apologized, so the apology had context, and the context was really the point. She glanced at him. You just said you were wrong. I was wrong. I know, that's what I'm saying. He was quiet for a moment. Sophie, I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 6 weeks, and I keep deciding to wait for the right moment. And I've started to think the right moment is a thing I've been using as an excuse. She turned to look at him. The wind off the lake moved between them. So say it, she said. He looked at the water for a second, then back at her. I don't know what this is yet. I want to be honest about that. I've been honest with you about everything else, and I'm not going to start performing certainty now. What I know is that the last 3 months have been the first time in 4 years that I have felt like something was possible. He paused. Not fixed, not finished, just possible. And I know that's because of you, specifically, and not just because you're the person who happened to be there. Sophie held his gaze. The wind was sharp off the lake, and her eyes were watering slightly from it, which she was going to attribute to the wind. I'm not an easy person, she said. I'm not saying that as a warning. I'm saying it because I think you should know what you're considering. I know what I'm considering. I spent 6 years trusting a process that didn't work, which has given me a complicated relationship with trust in general, which means I will probably question things that don't need to be questioned and push back on things that are fine and… Sophie, he said. What? I read your letter twice on a Tuesday morning in October, and I've talked to you almost every day since then, and I've been watching you argue about labor policy enforcement mechanisms with the same intensity that other people bring to things they love. He said it plainly, without ornament. I know who you are. I'm not asking for a different version of it. She looked at him for a long moment. The lake moved behind him. The man with the dog had gone. The two of them stood at the railing in the January cold, with the city and the water and the gray sky around them, and the specific weight of a moment that is not a beginning exactly. Too much had already happened for it to be a beginning, but is the place where two separate lines finally arrive at the same point. Okay, she said. He looked at her carefully. Okay, what? Okay, I'm not going to argue with that, she said. I reserve the right to be difficult about everything else. But I'm not going to argue with that specific thing. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a settling. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just been given an answer they weren't completely sure was coming. That's the most commitment-averse form of yes I've ever heard, he said. It's the form I have available. I'll take it. They stood at the railing for a while longer, not touching, just present in the same cold January air, looking at the lake. After a while, Sophie said, Maya's going to think I'm strange. Maya is going to think you're extraordinary, Nathan said. She already does, based on things I've told her, and she has not yet had an incorrect read on a person in her life. She's 7. She's intensely, specifically 7, he said, and she heard in his voice what she had heard the night before. That particular mixture of exasperation and love, and something that was simply the sound of a person who has organized their life around a small human and is not sorry about it. After Christmas, Sophie said. That was our agreement. Now it's after Christmas. It is, he said. So what comes next? He turned to look at her, and she looked back, and the lake moved and the city made its city sounds behind them, and the cold kept being cold, which it had no intention of stopping for anyone's convenience. That's up to both of us, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She turned up her collar and they began to walk. Along the path, northward, with the lake on one side and the city on the other, neither of them pretending they knew exactly what they were doing or where it was going, which was, Sophie had come to understand, not a flaw in the situation. It was just the truth of it, and she had spent her whole adult life learning that the truth of things, however complicated, was almost always better than the comfortable version. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. Sophie had warned him about this, that she was not an easy person, and it turned out to be accurate in ways she hadn't fully accounted for herself. She was, for example, genuinely difficult to argue with because she prepared her positions thoroughly, which Nathan found both challenging and, she suspected, privately satisfying. She was private about things that surprised him, not evasive, just contained in the way of a person who has spent years protecting what little she had from institutional judgment. She was slow to change her mind and fast to notice when someone was trying to change it through means other than the merit of their argument. Nathan, for his part, was not uncomplicated either, which she appreciated in the specific way you appreciate honesty about a thing rather than a performance of its absence. He worked too much and then felt guilty about it and then worked more to compensate, which was a loop Rachel had apparently been trying to interrupt for 3 years. He was better at listening than at asking. He could hear everything you said and process it accurately, but he sometimes needed to be asked directly what he was thinking because his default was to internalize first and share only what seemed relevant. He missed his wife in the particular shapeless way of grief that doesn't announce itself clearly. Sophie didn't know it from what he said, but from what he didn't say. The occasional pauses in certain conversations, the way he sometimes looked at Maya when Maya wasn't watching, a look that was love and loss, and the specific weight of raising alone the person you both made. She never said she understood this because she didn't, but she didn't look away from it either. Maya, in the event, turned out to like Sophie immediately and without apparent deliberation, which was the outcome Nathan had predicted, and which Sophie had privately doubted, because children were not always easy to earn, and she had not in her life been around them enough to feel confident about it. Maya was 8 by the time they met, in late January, at a pizza place near Nathan's apartment that Maya had selected on the grounds that it had a photo booth in the back corner, which was, she explained to Sophie with the directness of a child who has decided you are someone worth explaining things to, an important feature in a restaurant. Sophie had been nervous in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not about Nathan, but about this specific 7 then 8-year-old who had apparently already formed opinions about her based on things her father had said, and who was now sitting across a pizza table regarding Sophie with the careful, slightly too direct gaze of a child who is conducting an assessment. "Dad says you know about plant soil," Maya said, after approximately 3 minutes of sizing up. Sophie blinked. "I know a little bit. You were doing the soil experiment for school." "I already finished that. I got an A-. Ms. Fraser said the sandy soil hypothesis was sound, but my conclusion could have been more detailed." "Ms. Fraser's not wrong." Maya looked at her. "That's what Dad said." "Well," Sophie said, "we both read a lot." Maya appeared to find this acceptable. She returned to her pizza with the focused commitment of a child who has completed a necessary social evaluation and is now ready to eat. Nathan, across the table, was looking at Sophie with an expression she read clearly and looked away from because she was not going to let him see that Maya Sterling had spent 3 minutes making her feel something she hadn't expected to feel. The pizza was good. The photo booth produced a strip of 4 photographs, 2 of which were blurry because Maya moved during the flash, one in which all 3 of them were laughing at something that happened between frames that Sophie couldn't quite remember afterward, and one that was still and clear. Maya in the middle, Nathan on one side, Sophie on the other. That Nathan had printed and framed without telling Sophie, which she discovered 3 months later on a shelf in his apartment and stood in front of for longer than she intended. The transparency standard was adopted by the state of Illinois in March, 8 months after the board vote that had rejected it. Not through Sterling Workplace Solutions, through the Illinois Workers' Rights Institute, with the backing of 3 labor organizations, 2 foundations, 2 state legislators who had been looking for exactly this kind of framework, and a very thorough policy document that had been developed over 5 months of revision by Nathan Sterling, who was no longer a CEO, and Sophie Bennett, who was now officially listed as a policy consultant and lead researcher, which was a title she had negotiated with the same careful attention she had given to the enforcement language in Section 6. The passage was not dramatic in the way that things on television are dramatic. It happened in a committee vote in Springfield that Sophie watched on a live stream at the kitchen table at 11:45 in the morning, with Eleanor sitting beside her and a cup of coffee going cold, and the particular low-grade anxiety of waiting for a vote that you've done everything you can to influence and can no longer control. The vote passed 14-3. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a laugh and squeezed Sophie's hand, and Sophie sat very still for a moment and looked at the screen and felt a specific sensation of something completing, not ending, not finishing, but arriving at a point that everything before it had been building toward. She texted Nathan, 14-3. His reply came in under 10 seconds. "I know. I'm watching." Then, "Sophie." Then, "Thank you." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about all the thank yous she might have said to him and hadn't, because they felt too large or too exposed or too easily mistaken for something other than what they were. She thought about October and a letter and a phone call she almost didn't answer. She typed, "We did this." He wrote back, "Yes, we did." The class action settlement for the Hartwell employees was reached in April. Not the full amount that Patricia Gaines had filed for, because settlements never were, but significant. 39 plaintiffs. Back wages dating to periods Sophie had documented and periods she hadn't known about. Carl Whitmore received, in addition to his settlement amount, a formal finding of retaliatory termination, which meant something legally and also something beyond legally. The specific acknowledgement that he had been right and had been punished for it, and that the record now reflected this. He called Sophie when the settlement was signed. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "My daughter's going back to school in the fall. Different school, better fit. She got a small scholarship." A pause. "I wanted you to know." "I'm glad," Sophie said. "Carl, I'm really glad." "How are you doing?" he asked. "The news has been covering the Illinois thing. Your name keeps coming up. I'm managing it." "The Sterling guy?" "Carl." "I'm just saying, I read some of the coverage. Seems like he did the right thing. A few times, actually, when it would have been easier not to." Sophie looked at her kitchen window, at the April light coming in sideways. Yes, she said. He did. Good, Carl said. You deserve someone who does the right thing. She didn't have a clean response to that, so she said, take care of yourself. And he said, you too. And they hung up in the easy way of people who don't need to maintain contact to maintain respect. By summer, the transparency standard had been formally adopted or was under active legislative consideration in 6 states. The independent verification requirement, Sophie's 72-hour provision, the 30-day corrective action timeline, the mandatory restitution language, was in every version. Nathan was traveling more than Sophie was fully comfortable with, speaking at labor conferences and testifying before legislative committees in 3 states, a schedule that she had opinions about and expressed, which he received and didn't always agree with. And they had arguments about it that were genuinely arguments and not performances of arguments, which she considered a mark of something real. He was in Sacramento when the 6th state adopted the standard. He called her from a hotel room at 10 p.m. Pacific time. 6 states, he said. I saw. Michigan's committee vote is in September. I know. I submitted the independent verification testimony last week. She was in her apartment now. Not the small one she'd shared with Eleanor, but a different one, larger, with a bedroom that had working heat and windows that closed properly, things she had negotiated hard for and had been able to afford since March. Eleanor had moved into a ground-floor apartment 2 blocks away, which Eleanor referred to as her independence, and which Sophie referred to as the arrangement that allowed them both to sleep. How's your mother? Nathan asked. Better. She's taken up a correspondence chess game with someone in New Mexico she met through an online forum. She's winning. Of course she is. She says to tell you the pasta was good. Nathan had made dinner for Eleanor 2 weeks earlier. Not a production, just pasta and a simple salad at Sophie's apartment, the 3 of them at the kitchen table that Sophie had bought secondhand in February and which had 4 chairs even though she had only ever needed 3. Eleanor had asked Nathan 3 questions during dinner that Sophie recognized as the specific interrogation her mother applied to people she was deciding about, and Nathan had answered all 3 directly, and Eleanor had said very little after that, which Sophie knew was its own verdict. Tell her thank you, Nathan said. I did. She's already planning her own menu for next time, which means she's going to want to supervise someone else making it. I can be supervised. I know, Sophie said. It's one of your better qualities. He laughed. She heard, in the hotel room behind him, the sounds of a city she'd never been to, and the particular quiet of a man alone in a room at 10 p.m., who was not entirely comfortable being alone in rooms anymore, which was something he had said to her once, in the specific, honest way he said things he would have preferred not to need to say. Come home soon, she said, which was the most unguarded thing she said regularly, and which she still had to make a small, deliberate choice to say each time. 4 more days, he said. 4 more days, she confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, and he was quiet, and they held that together the way they had learned to hold things, with attention rather than words, which was its own language. Nathan, she said. Yeah. I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity. Okay. I'm not good at this, she said, at any of this. The trusting and the letting people in and the not managing everything from a distance. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that it makes things harder sometimes. I'm working on it. I'm not promising I'll get much better at it. Sophie, I'm not finished. Okay. But I also want you to know that this, what we have, whatever it is, the policy work and the dinners and Maya's photo booth pictures and fighting about your travel schedule, this is the first thing in a long time that I haven't wanted to protect myself from. She paused. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but I wanted to say it. The silence on the other end was the good kind, the processing kind. I know what it means, Nathan said quietly. You might be projecting. I might be, he said, but I don't think so. She looked at the kitchen table, at the 4 chairs. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he said. I'll be home. In September, Maya Sterling started 3rd grade with a new teacher and a science project topic of her own selection, The migratory patterns of monarch butterflies, which she had chosen, she explained to Sophie on the first day of school, because butterflies go somewhere specific when things get hard, and then they come back, which is interesting. Sophie had sat with this for a moment. 8-year-old Maya was sitting at the kitchen table of Nathan's apartment, eating an after-school snack with the focused application she brought to all tasks, and she had said this about butterflies with the casual certainty of a child who has not yet learned to doubt that the things she finds interesting are worth finding interesting. "That is interesting," Sophie said. "I know," said Maya. "I'm going to make a migration map. Can you help me with the data part?" "Yes," Sophie said. "I can help you with the data part." Maya nodded as if this were already established and returned to her snack. Sophie sat down at the table across from her and opened her laptop and thought about migration. The idea of going somewhere specific when things get hard and then coming back, which was, she reflected, not the worst framework for the last 12 months of her life. She had not set out to be here. She had set out to leave a job with $63 in her bank account and no plan. With a letter she'd spent 45 minutes writing in a fury of exhaustion and loss, addressed to a man who had never read it. She had ended up in a policy framework that was changing lives in 6 states, in a freelance practice that was genuinely sustainable, in an apartment with working heat, with a mother 2 blocks away who was winning at chess and giving opinions freely and starting to look, Sophie thought, less exhausted. In something with a man who forgot his hat in January and had a daughter with a cover page sensibility and who said the true thing without making it a performance. She had not planned any of it. She was not sure, looking back, that she could have. There was a version of the lesson that was about fate or design. The idea that the email being sent to the wrong address was always going to happen, that it was part of some larger structure. Sophie didn't believe in that version. She had spent too many years watching things not work out, watching the truth be documented and ignored and documented again, to believe that the universe had a plan for her specifically. What she believed, what 6 years and 1 misdirected email and a November board vote and a class action settlement and 14 state committee votes had taught her, was something smaller and more precise. That documentation matters. That the truth put carefully into words and sent into the world, even when it lands wrong, even when it reaches the wrong person, even when it is used badly and then corrected, even when it takes 6 years and 17 emails and 1 resignation letter and a whole year of complicated work to matter, that the truth put carefully into words is not wasted. It finds its way. Not always in the way you intended, not always in time, but it finds its way. Sophie Bennett had written a letter she wasn't supposed to write, sent it to an address she hadn't meant to send it to, and refused to be anything other than exactly who she was in every conversation that followed. She had not been strategic about it. She had not designed an outcome. She had just kept telling the truth in the precise, documented, unsparing way that was the only way she knew how to tell it. And she had kept doing the work, and she had kept saying no to the comfortable version and yes to the correct one. And she had kept, in the middle of all of it, being difficult and cautious and imperfect and thoroughly, inconveniently herself. It had not worked out smoothly. It had cost her things. It had taken longer than it should have and hurt more than it needed to. And there were still outcomes that were incomplete. Workers whose situations the settlement hadn't fully resolved, states where the standard was stalled in committee, moments in her relationship with Nathan where they argued badly and had to come back to it later and try again with more care. But it was real. The whole of it was real, in the specific way that things are real when they haven't been edited for comfort. On an evening in late October, 1 year, almost exactly, after the morning she had sat at a kitchen table at Hartwell Regional Logistics and written a letter she had not been planning to write, Sophie walked the 2 blocks to her mother's apartment and found Eleanor on the phone with her chess opponent in New Mexico, gesturing with her free hand the way she did when she was making a strategic point. Sophie let herself in with the key Eleanor had given her and sat down on the couch and waited. Eleanor finished the call and sat down across from her. "You look different," Eleanor said. "Same coat," Sophie said. "Broken zipper on the left pocket. I still haven't taken it to the tailor." "Not the coat," Eleanor said. "You." Sophie thought about the bus ride from the office, where she'd spent the afternoon working on the Michigan testimony, the October light coming in the bus windows in that sideways October way, the lake visible between buildings as they moved east. She thought about Maya's butterfly migration map, which was currently hanging on the refrigerator at Nathan's apartment and which was genuinely good. The data points precise, the migration routes carefully traced, the conclusion section detailed per Ms. Fraser's feedback. She thought about the fact that she no longer counted things. The coughs, the days before the first of the month, the dollars in the account. She had not stopped counting because the threats had disappeared entirely. The world did not cooperate with that level of resolution. But the counting had stopped anyway, replaced by something she was still finding words for. Something that was not certainty, because certainty was for people who didn't pay attention, and she paid attention to everything. Something more like readiness. The readiness of a person who has learned, through loss and work, and a year of being precisely herself at precisely the right time, that she can handle what comes because she has handled what came. "I'm okay," Sophie told her mother. "I think I'm actually okay." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has watched her daughter carry things that were too heavy for too long and has prayed, without saying so, without invoking anything specific, just in the quiet, internal way of a mother's hoping, that something would eventually ease. "I know," Eleanor said. "I can see it." Sophie reached across and put her hand over her mother's, briefly, and then pulled it back, because she was still Sophie Bennett, still contained, still imperfectly calibrated to tenderness. But she had put her hand there, which was something, which was, she thought, enough for now. Outside, the October light was doing its thing again, low, sideways, the particular gold of a city in autumn, coming through the windows of a small apartment on the north side of Chicago, where two women sat across from each other in the early evening quiet. 1 year ago, Sophie had sat in a different apartment, at a different table, and written the truest thing she knew and sent it into the dark. She had not known where it would go. She had not known what it would cost or what it would build or what it would eventually become. She knew now, imperfectly, incompletely, in the specific, sufficient way that real things are known. Not all at once, not without remainder, but enough. The light moved on the wall. The city made its sounds. Eleanor picked up her chess notation pad and returned to her game. And Sophie Bennett sat in the autumn evening and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, which was, she had come to understand, what it felt like when you had finally, improbably, landed somewhere worth being,